Hello, am I audible? Sorry about the delay. I am quite sick today, so I'm going to be a little bit low energy, unfortunately. It took a little bit longer than I wanted to get set up, but in any case, the long-belated review. It was originally going to be a watch party where I would have a couple guests on to watch it in real time, but life intervened, and frankly, the scheduling was very strange. I actually couldn't for the life of me figure out what time it was running on the day of, and I don't think it would have worked for any of my guests anyway, since I think most of them were not in North America. They're like 3 or more hours ahead of me, so. Anyways, for those who are new to the channel again, welcome. I'm President Sunday. We're going to be going over a debate between Infrared, or Haas, and what is his name? Something Logo, or Logo something. Some other Hegelian guy. I know Haas is smart. Crazy, but smart. Joel Davis is... I haven't seen a bit of this debate, so I'm going in totally blind. Joel Davis I have spoken to briefly on a channel that I didn't fully understand at the time. But my impression of him was reasonably intelligent, minus the company he keeps. I don't know anything about his positions. And Keith Woods is a self-described third positionist. You can read that as some variation of fascist in the... not like as identical to Nazi, but I would say probably in practical terms equivalent if somebody like that was ever in power. So, you know. Big differences. Logo Daedalus, thank you. So the other Haas's partner is Logo Daedalus, somebody I know nothing about. Echo is good. Oh, no, sorry, you're talking about Umberto Eco, okay. I thought there was an echo in my audio. Do I have a list of all the music I use? Yes, and I posted onto my Discord server, which I think I actually opened up today. Yeah, so if you want to join the Discord, if you go into the description of this video, there is a link. Excuse me, sorry about that. I'm so gross right now, so if I have to call it early, I apologize. But we're going to try and go through the whole thing. This is a 2.5 hour long debate, so strap yourselves in. It's going to be pretty grueling. This is on the kill stream, of course. The host is an idiot, not like in a practical sense, but just it was so frustrating because when this was originally posted, the announcement, it was shown as an argument about fascism specifically, and that struck me as very interesting. The way the topic was adjusted is also interesting. Now it's about whether China is fascist, which strikes me as very strange since Keith and Joel are going to be something very close to fascist adjacent, and Infrared and Logo Daedalus are going to be, of course, socialists of some stripe. So it strikes me that how this debate must be going is that Keith and Joel are going to be characterizing China as fascist, as if that's a negative. Meanwhile, they themselves would probably positively affirm something that most people would characterize as sort of in the ballpark of fascism. So that's going to be interesting. Anyways, I'm done rambling. Let's just get through this.
Ladies and gentlemen,
let me know if the audio is good.
Hello and welcome to the Kill Stream. I am your host, Ethan Ralph, the owner and the editor-in-chief of the RalphRetort.com. There I am. There's the 3 view. Here comes the double view. They're already talking. You can't hear him just yet. There's Logo. Let me switch over. So usually we have the special layout with the debate and me in the middle, but there's 4 people, so I didn't really think that I didn't know if that would work right. So we're gonna switch between the 3 view and the double view here. All right, now let me unmute the tab. Logo's coughing like I just wasn't gonna go right before we came on air. All right, now.
Corona, I'm not sure though.
All right, now we can hear you. Hopefully it's not Corona. Speaking of Corona, Biden gave his speech earlier. We covered that at the end of Tequila Sunrise. If you want to check that out, it'll be on killstream.tv later. Okay, you know what? Let's just jump right into it. I know everybody's got their own scheduling and stuff like that, so Logo, you were talking. We're going to do 5-minute introductions here. I dubbed it as the fascism debate, although it's a little, you know,
yeah.
more
oh, so am I up? Am I talking
Yeah, I
now?
figured why not?
I have the floor?
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I'm pretty sure that what the debate's supposed to be about, I think there were 2 subjects. The first one would be whether or not we would define China under Xi Jinping as fascist. I don't think that really makes sense as a discussion topic because it's going to come down to like just fucking arbitrary definition games. And for me to go with like the Communist Party calls itself communist, it is communist. It's called itself communist for like almost 100 years. It's the oldest communist party that's still in existence and governs the state. I don't see any reason not to call them what they call themselves. It seems pretty simple to me.
I love his eye movements. He's like blinking with one eye at a time like a chameleon. It's kind of intimidating, actually.
And I think it's like justifiable in all ways. The other one was regarding whether or not capitalists funded fascists during World War II or like their movement leading up to it. I think capitalists personally funded pretty much all sides because capitalists tend to like hedge their bets. So they invest in pretty much everything. You know, I mean, this is something Donald Trump would say, right? Where he's like, if you're a capitalist, you fund all political parties because you're going to need all of them at some point. So I don't really see that also is like that interesting of a debate, considering like the communists were also funded by some capitalists at some times, and it all goes down to minutia. So I'm more interested in having a discussion with these guys because I think that we have similar ways of looking at things in some respects, but we have some other disagreements, which we'll probably get into. I think we could have a productive discussion. I don't really know debates. Debates seem to me kind of like spectacle and like a farce, and they don't seem to produce much of value. So that's my opening statement, I guess.
All right.
So why did you choose to go into a debate? Yeah, I think I agree with that characterization of it. Fascism has a very particular content, and when we're trying to describe an explicitly non-fascist state, both in form and its explicit project, like of course it calls itself the Communist Party, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't like the idea of using the term fascist when it has a definite content historically, as just a synonym for authoritarian or even even tyrannical government, simply because again, like all government is authoritarian, definitionally. All politics is involving authority and violence. So describing those things as fascist in a certain extreme is basically just to valorize a certain kind of authority over another one. But it also misses out on the peculiar content of fascism, which is actually super important to pay attention to. So I'm in agreement with Logo so far. He seems like a smart cookie.
Well, we'll just stick with your side, and then we'll go to the other. Go ahead, Infrahead. You've never been on the show. Logo actually has been on the show a while back. Why don't you go ahead and put your side out there?
I'm Haz. I'm from the Infrared Collective. We run the Infrared YouTube channel, and we're on Twitch at twitch.tv/Infrared Show. We call ourselves a platform for Marxism, Leninism in the age of multipolarity and the post-COVID world. And so specifically as it concerns this debate, I think the way I want to approach this is pretty much from two levels. One, I think the discussion or the debate about the character of China has to rest upon a specific assumption about the relationship between content and form and appearance and essence. Now, Marxism itself, having grounded itself in a specific ontology or metaphysics of the materialist dialectic, recognizes there's a contradiction between content and form. There is no fixed doctrine that premises the development of reality, and Marxism is just an index of the recognition of this fact. If we assume that content and form are one and the same, then as a matter of fact, we would have to concede that there's no possible way we could call it China, which is governed by a communist party, governed by people, ruled by people who call themselves Marxists and communists, who describe the system in which they live as communist. This is the form. We cannot say the essence of this form is fascist, because this would imply there's a contradiction between appearance and essence. But that same very contradiction is the object of Marxism itself. And on the other hand, if we are also not permitted to describe fascism beyond what fascist intellectuals have described of their own theory and ideas and so-called doctrine, then it doesn't make sense that we would assume there's a deeper essence to Chinese Marxism beyond what's already on the surface. So I detect a contradiction in these two facets of the debate between whether fascism was in fact liberalism in crisis and in an emergency mode, which obviously contradicts what fascist intellectuals themselves said about it. And on the other hand, the question of whether China is fascist, despite Chinese Marxists and intellectuals never describing, well, the overwhelming majority of Chinese intellectuals at least, never describing their own system and their own country as fascist. So to me, I think the debate will have to revolve around developing and addressing this specific contradiction between form and content.
See, I like this opening, especially in this context. Has a reputation for going onto stream and just kind of like barking at people and being verbally abusive, and that's sort of a part of his brand. He's wickedly smart. I wonder if he overplays the persona a little bit and loses some respect from people who just aren't willing to look through that. I mean, I had a fairly biased view against him early on until I actually saw him perform. Very, very smart person. Again, I don't agree with him on a lot, but smart. That's an interesting distinction he's making. By the way, just a warning for anybody in the audience who would have like an issue with observing this. What I have heard at several degrees of remove is that there is quite a bit of racial insults near the end from, I don't know if it's from the participants or from the audience, but that might come up. So just, I don't know when that's going to pop up. So just be advised that that's a thing that you don't want to watch.
All right, Mr. Woods, Keith Woods, go ahead. Can you hear me?
Oh, this is kind of funny. So my understanding is that Keith Woods is like 6.5 feet tall. Like he's like a beanpole. I think Haas is actually slightly shorter than me. So it's weird because Haas looks huge and Keith Woods looks tiny. But Keith Woods is like gigantic and Haas is probably like, I'm conjecturing because I've heard he's like under 6 feet, but he's like there, which is interesting.
Me sure.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I'm not sure about that line of argument. I'm interested to hear where Has goes with that, but I think we can look at the history of fascism. We can look at what fascist theorists believed and how they governed.
Oh, did I fail to turn my mic on? My audio is pretty low, huh? What is that all about? Hang on, let's fix this. How are we now? Is that better? Let's just make sure the audio is good before we keep going. Much better? Okay, that's weird. I didn't do anything, so that is strange. You know what I think happened? I think I forgot to hit the... So the way my thing works here is I have a button on my mic that I press to turn it off, and sometimes I forget to press it. And I think what happens is when I forget to press it, my webcam mic starts to be the thing that picks up the audio. So we'll just have to keep an eye on that. But I like the clicky thing because it lets me not have to like stop the video, go into OBS and click that to switch.
And then we can single out fascism as a class of developmental nationalism with specific characteristics. And I think when we look at China, I don't think it's good enough to say that the CCP still identifies as communist, that they still consider themselves to be carrying on a lineage that includes Marx and Lenin and Mao and so on. I mean, the United States claims to be the ultimate bastion of freedom and liberty, but I don't think anyone here is going to agree with that exactly. I think it's important in terms of where we're going. I mean, everyone on this, I think we have large agreements in terms of the direction of things. I mean, I saw Has the other day was kind of defending a kind of national populist position that I wouldn't really disagree with so much. But I think the Marxist baggage kind of hinders things. And I don't think it's a good model to explain China's success or to map onto other countries that are attempting to kind of navigate the sort of post-colonial direction that I think Has thinks we're going in. As far as fascists being funded by capitalists, I mean, you can say, yeah, every side is funded by capitalists, but the historical record is quite clear on this. I mean, there's some books that amount to conspiracy theories like Conjuring Hitler that try and piece together stuff that isn't there. But if you look at the really respected historians in this, like Henry Ashby Turner, there's wide-ranging agreement that the fascist movements were largely funded by small business owners, the unemployed, people in rural areas. There was no real big business support to speak of. There was a couple of industrialists that briefly supported Hitler. We can get into that later. One of them was later put in Dachau concentration camp. And really, I think they're going to repeat a lot of Marxist mythology about fascism that came out of the communist Comintern in the 20s and 30s, where communists were rushing to explain what was going on with their preconceived notions, but most of these theories didn't look at empirical facts at all. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Joel.
Go ahead, Joel. Joel Davis, by the way, first time on the show as well. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so from what I said before about, we can't tell Marxists what Marxism is, because if we say that, Marxists can't tell fascists what fascism is, I feel like this is BS. Like, this is the truth. And that's just ideological nonsense. Like, the truth is the truth. Someone's got to be right. I mean, maybe both are wrong, but we can't both be right because they're totally incompatible positions. So that's why this needs to be a debate. Anyway, so I think there's probably no notion more integral to Marxist thought than the assertion that material historical analysis is kind of integral to theorizing the political, right? So like for Marx, this means that the mode of production by which humanity generates the means of its own survival is the basis of all social and political structure. And I think this is correct, like when stated like this. But I think Marxism's fundamental flaw is its reduction of the production of the means of life to its economic aspect. And as a consequence, it reduces the social and the political to the economic. And I think if you reject this reduction, you have to kind of reject the Marxist theoretical reduction of the state to the role of a mere enforcer of class domination in response to antagonism between economic classes. And this ruptures like the entire theory of Marxism.
I think, just to jump in there quickly, I think that's actually a mistake For the simple reason that, again, the social as a category is itself going to be something that is downstream from a specific mode of production. We don't simply have this part of a community called society just, ubiquitous in history. It's a fairly recent development.
You can't patch it together once you make that call. So it's a big question. The concrete material historical reality of politics and economics, yes, obviously economics plays a role, but it also takes place within geography, and the institutional capacity of political orders to secure themselves against internal and external enemies is an organizational question which transcends mere economic factors and is also material historical.
Okay, so what he's doing is he's assuming the modern state form irrespective of modes of production. The problem is that the modern state form is directly connected to a certain mode of production or to certain modes of production and to certain contingent historical events. So there's going to be, that is, I think, where he's going to get nailed on this one, because he's accepting the premise that the social or community form reflects the mode of production, but then he's essentializing the community form as something that's ubiquitous throughout history, irrespective of our technological or economic, changes. Do you think China's fascist? No, I don't think China's fascist. I don't think necessarily that China is I don't like the Chinese government, but it's not fascist.
And these conditions forced both the Bolsheviks and the CCP to take actions which violated, in my view, their Marxist-Leninist ideological priors, and we can get into that a bit.
Which, by the way, does not mean, just because a government is not fascist doesn't mean it's necessarily better than a fascist one. When I use the term fascist, I'm referring to a specific community form or a specific form of rule or a specific state ideology. I am not referring to whether or not the state is bad or good. Now, you can track pretty well whether or not a state is bad or good to the extent that it approximates to a fascist form, but that's a different question.
Later. But when we look at the Russian and Chinese revolutions themselves, we can see in both cases that the revolutions only occurred because they seized opportunities that were induced by politically destabilizing conflicts between dominant economic and political classes. In both cases, you have the landed gentry.
Okay, so Einzelganger, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, says, so what did Mussolini and Gentili joined... Sorry, so Mussolini and Gentili joined socialism and nationalism, right? As far as I know, fascism used to be referred to as collectivism. That's interesting. I'm not aware of that. But if you read the Doctrine of Fascism, which is ostensibly by Mussolini, but is actually ghostwritten by a major Italian Hegelian scholar named Giovanni Gentili, and you read the ending portion of Hegel's philosophy of right, which is where he lays out his political philosophy explicitly, it's a simplified version of that. It's almost to a T. Which is not in itself a bad thing. It's what it was used for later on. And in fact, of course, it's incorrect to characterize fascism strictly in those terms because it became more reactionary and it mutated over time. Because it's not simply a political theory, it's also a movement. And when you're talking about a movement, you're not necessarily talking about what logically follows from a theoretical system, right?
And the monarchies respectively. And this conflict was both cases a result of not of economic antagonism, but the geopolitical pressure that inducing a kind of political antagonism between organizational requirements of the state's internal and external security, impacting the interests of the dominant economic class. And this provoked the gentry in both cases to support challenging and deposing the Romanov and Manchu dynasties respectively. And this
he kind of looks like he's in a Davros chair, doesn't he?
And created power vacuums, which the Bolsheviks and CCP respectively capitalize upon. Now, class obviously played a role in these revolutions. There's obviously, not negating class completely, but they are complex historical events that are irreducible to the mere economic dynamics of class. And we see direct evidence for this with states like Japan or Prussia, which transitioned from feudalism to industrial capitalism without requisite social revolutions, nuking their monarchies and communist parties taking over. So there's contingency in history that needs to be explained. And I bring all this up because the first point of my argument is that China might be ideologically Marxist, but it's not materially historically Marxist, I would argue. And in fact, nothing is, because...
No state is material historically Marxist, because historical materialism is a mode of analysis. It's a way of tracking the development of social forms by reference to changes in modes of production and things like that. Somebody asked an interesting question: what's the least bad state in your opinion? In a sense, I'm not entirely sure the question by itself is valid, because the modern state form depends for its power and its coherence and all the good things and bad things we associate with it on its network of relations with other states. And so when we're talking about whether or not one state is good or bad, it is almost inevitably going to be good or bad because of its relationships with other states. So if we're going to refer to the characteristics of one state as bad, yet those characteristics are required for another state to be good, that strikes me as a meaningless distinction, right? We're talking no longer about individual states like islands in an ocean. We're talking about like a world system that happens to include things that are still called states. Maybe that term is obsolete.
Marxism fails to accurately theorize material history, and the assertion that it is Marxist is pure abstraction, pure ideology. It has no relation to concrete reality. And that kind of betrays the Marxist project fundamentally, And the material historical reality of the contemporary Chinese state, however, I think bears far closer resemblance to fascism or National Socialism. And this is precisely because both these ideologies rejected Marxism's economic reductionism in favor of a geopolitical conception of the state's responsibilities, which justify the very state-led, pragmatic, developmentalist economic model that we see in contemporary China, as well as the CCP's promotion of nationalist socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, China is so successful, in my view, precisely because Marx was wrong about the state. States aren't reducible to class antagonism, and this is why states like China and Hitler's Germany could subordinate the economic sphere to a national idea and politically administer collaboration between economic classes. And we see this contradiction of Marx expressed in contemporary CCP.
Okay, so that is where that is where the characterization of well, there's a reason why Carl Schmitt, who was like one of the most eminent political theorists of the Nazi Party, characterizes the modern state form as largely the liberal state. Why? Well, because it's not so much that the point isn't that the economic sphere is unadministrated. It's always administrated. The point is that the economic sphere as a separate sphere is always separate, and as such is an essential part of the modern state form. So Joel's not stupid, but the problem is that he's thinking into essentialist terms. And to be fair, it's very difficult to not with this stuff, right? Oh, thank you, Saints and Scholars. I appreciate that. Yes, I have been.
Ideology with doctrines like the Three Represents, which is an emulation of Mussolini's heretical rejection of the Marxist doctrine of class struggle. And so when Marxists proclaim that China isn't real Marxism, I think they're right, because there is no real Marxism in practice. It's simply impossible to practice a theory which is so fundamentally flawed. But real National Socialism has been tried, and it's the most effective political system modernity has ever produced. And this is why the CCP are the most successful government on the planet right now, in my view.
Oh my God. So just a final note that I wanted to make, and I was going to make earlier and I forgot. So when he says that the Chinese state's governance is more similar to fascist government than to socialist government, I think that's what he said, something like that. He's correct, obviously, but that's because fascism is, again, a state ideology. Well, it's a state ideology, whereas socialism is a post-state ideology, or at least it's a post-state state of affairs, if you will. Again, like one of the reasons why Marx and Marxists are so reticent about talking about what a future political form would look like is because they were precisely not in the business of planning out future regimes. They were theorists ultimately of how do you undo the chains of current structures, things like that. Because and this is what Marx says in the Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte is. The French revolutionists failed because they were repeating the poetry of the Ancien Regime. In essence, all of their categories simply led to them. I know this is actually somewhat incorrect in a lot of ways, but the critique runs basically that all they could do, because they weren't thinking outside of the old terms, is rearrange the stuff that was already there. I mean, there's a lot to that, like historically. It's just I think it maybe underplays a little bit the actual radical changes that took place, of course, which Marx is aware of. He claims Australia had been in a good way prior to the 60s and had been National Socialist just to represent his claim. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so when Joel says National Socialist, and he really should be clarifying this, he doesn't mean Nazi per se. Anyways, let's keep going.
So yeah, I'll start with that.
All right, now I'm going to let you guys just get right into it. Now, one of the features of the Killstream debates is the questioning of each other, and especially on a topic like this, is not my forte necessarily, although I know a little bit, but you guys were already into this subject, basically arguing amongst yourselves. I brought it to the Killstream, so I see no reason to kind of stop that, and I'll just go ahead and start with Keith. If you have any like debate points you want to start with here, or like critiques of the other side's position that you'd like to like kind of begin the program with, or Joel, y'all side, it's kind of a tag team affair.
Well, I'd just start with maybe getting some agreement on definitions. And I guess I'd ask Infrared or Logo what their definition of socialism is, because I think this is going to come up a lot later on when they try to say that fascism was a form of capitalism.
Well, the way I see it is there isn't a country in the world that isn't socialist right now. Like socialism, sort of like a word like democracy, where pretty much every single, well, I don't know, are there any states that don't justify themselves on a democratic line of some sort at this point. I think socialism was like the result of like.
I get what he's trying to say, or at least I think what he's trying to say, but he's wrong. There are no there are no socialist states. There are states that have, like, in the vulgar sense, kind of a socialist ethos with respect, and by ethos I mean like attitude with respect to like policies and things like that. Like there's a greater or lesser tendency to redistribute wealth, than, like, relatively speaking. But to say that the modern state form is democratic is not to say that it is socialist. They are democratic in the sense that power is upstream from, or shall I say rather, power is emergent from these arbitrarily delineated, parts of the community. But beyond that, they're not. It's just, he's just muddling terms here, which is a bit frustrating.
Fundamentally, it was like a global revolution that happened at the end of the 19th century. And I think, like, America's been a socialist country for just as long as everywhere else. So I think that socialism is just like the state of things as they are now.
I think we actually, the Infrared Collective, we produced a number of videos on the question of the essence of socialism. And the basic idea is that socialism must be understood and defined within the context of the loss of sociality, this common object that is the object of common civilization, statehood, culture, and so on and so on. Some common sociality, which in basically the history following from then. And then we can trace, for example, the modern financial institutions and so on that really are kind of the heart of 21st century capitalism, or whatever survives of it. You can actually trace their lineage back to this historical period. So I think when we say, for example, I've put up forward this idea too, that, we can also say America is socialist. One has to think dialectically. We're not necessarily saying that capitalism has completely been eliminated and capitalism is gone, but that capitalism has kind of reduced its real basis to the kind of vestigial, institutional, and superstructural form of essentially socialistic mode of production.
Yeah, I mean, like, the thing is that, like, our modern financial system was created by socialists. Like, if we're talking about, like, hedge funds managing people's pensions and shit like that, like basically how everything works in America, that was developed by socialists as like a way of restraining. Like, capitalists were basically like, they were like destroying people's pension funds and things like this. This was causing like major economic crashes and shit throughout the 20th century. So, like, the development of like Bretton Woods system and all that stuff, this is all done by people who called themselves socialists. I mean, Carnegie,
yeah, sure, but I mean,
these guys all called themselves socialists. So, like,
yeah, sure, but I mean, there is some sense in which we can say China is socialist in a way that the US isn't, and the US is a capitalist country. I mean, I think,
agree.
Yeah, I've heard a definition from Has before that I'd agree with, where I think Has said that socialism is the mode of production directed toward a social end. That's maybe a little bit ambiguous, but I think we can agree that
it still seems so tautological to me, though. It's like, socialism is so. Yeah, like, what do you mean? Like, it's like the definition is so broad, it's like meaningless.
Well, the thing is that I think that, like, the use of a definition, right, is like how much it brings like coherence or clarity to the world. So when I say something like every state in the world right now is socialist, I think that does actually like transfer some meaningful information, and it does lay a groundwork for how we understand
to be clear,
communism would be the overcoming.
So here's the thing, right? I have made many arguments before about the limitations of definitions and the Anglo box and so on. So I have made a simple definition of socialism. If you're not satisfied with the definition, just ask for clarification and I can elaborate.
I'm kind of interested in, do you consider China to be communist, or is it like, because I mean, from what I can tell, like the CCP seems to say, well, no, we're a socialist country. We're on our way to communism. It might take 100 years. And like, how would you define communism? How do we know when it's here? Because do you take Marx's definition, or do you disagree with Marx?
I can answer this question. So there's two senses of the word communism that are used by communist parties. One is a society that has already been set, as Marx put it, on its basis of a communistic mode of production. A society so thoroughly transformed by the process of communism that it is it is a mode of production entirely distinct from the old one. It doesn't have the kind of birthmarks of the old mode of production, so to speak. And then in the other sense is communism as a world historical force, which is actually how Marx described it. Marx said, by communism, we do not mean an ideal with society will have to conform itself to, but the real movement which sublates the present state of things. So in the sense of that Marx put it as the real movement, yes, China is communist, but in the sense of how Chinese Marxists conceive of, the different stages of socialism and a communist mode of production, a society so thoroughly transformed by this process that, for example, money has become eliminated. The kind of principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their need prevails. Superabundance, the advanced development of the forces of production to the point of the complete elimination of want, and so on and so on. That is
like Star Trek.
I really hate that example. I think
because what I don't get, because like from reading Marx, he seems like obviously Marx develops his thought a lot throughout his career, but he has this concept of species being, this idea that like within us we have this natural proclivity to do whatever the fuck we want. I want to play guitar, I want to go build a house, I want to fish, I want to read a book, and then capitalism forces us to do some like repetitive process, like if we're like some proletarian, it's like proletarian in a factory.
To clarify.
And this alienates us from our kind of inherent our inherent nature to kind of actualize ourselves in the world. And the goal of communism would be ultimately this kind of almost like utopic notion, it seems like, of self-actualization. It's what you get from Marx's early writing, at least, when he's talking about his critique of alienation.
There's just really quick, two important things I want to clarify. Actually, it's Marx's humanism, species being, that we derive the unique Marxist view of socialism. So when we say mode of production for social ends, these social ends are the determinate form of humanity so far as the socialistic country or society is concerned. It's the specific type of human being whose needs and wants must be addressed at some kind of collective level, whose baseline standard of living and dignity and sense of ownership and stake in the economy and so on. And then the second thing regarding this, what you're talking about is Marx's description of the division of labor. So Marx's point is not that as human beings we have the proclivity to be whimsical about the different things we do, that as if like our different mode of activity in life is not rational. It's just completely based on arbitrary individual whim. And then from this misinterpretation, you get tendencies like Falk, fully automated luxury communism. Communism means no one works, we just do what we want and so on. But Marx's point is not so much about doing whatever we want, as so much as it is about the way in which the division of labor interpolates us and forces us to be one. For example, Marx says, I can fish in the afternoon, I don't forget what he specifically says, work in the evening and then write in the morning or something, without, and this is the important part, without ever becoming a fisherman, a writer, or a craftsman. So Marx's point is not the like freedom to just do whatever you want whimsically, but human activity developing in a way that is in accordance with the inherent and latent abilities of human beings.
Yeah, so what he's talking about is, the idea here is that obviously the way profit works is you produce the cost of your own labor, and then you produce the cost of whatever it was that was produced and sold, and then whatever is in excess, that is hoarded by the person who owns the things that you need in order to do that production. And because there is a limited number of people who hold these tools, they can, hold the conditions of your survival and sustenance as basically a hostage. So you need to work more than you actually need to in absolute terms to produce value for society, such that society can grow and become better for the aggrandizement of the person who holds those things. So the idea being is, if there is an administration of this such that the products of labor is allocated in a more socially minded sense, as opposed to just being hoarded for the benefit of the person who just happens to own the land or the tools or whatever reason, because workers are going to be less exploited. They still need to work, but then they'll have more time, because what is being extracted from them with a gun to the head is effectively their time. So someone's talking about, oh, I see, you guys are arguing about whether or not socialism or capitalism needs a state. Anyways, we'll keep going.
Which, of course, will differ across different people, different individuals, and so on and so on. But Marx's underlying point is about the division of labor. It's about the way labor is given a fixed form. The form of labor becomes fixed and is no longer allowed to develop as human labor as such.
That was really poorly put on Haz's part, unfortunately. I had a lot of trouble following what he was saying. Granted, I'm super under the weather, so that may be on me, but I have a strong sense that what's going to happen is Joel and Keith are just going to ignore that entire thing and just move on.
That makes sense.
I don't know. It just seems like it seems kind of retarded to me, because I mean, and this gets to what I was saying in my original statement about, the material historical reality of geopolitics, the material historical reality of institutions and organization and the political, and this idea that like economic relations is like the driving force behind history. It just seems like a BS to me. Like if you take the example of the Soviet Union, and you look at like the Russian Revolution, you look at Lenin in say in Revolution, he's talking about we're going to abolish bureaucratized militaries. We're going to have this the workers are going to run the factories. They're going to have their own arms. We're not going to. And then but then the reality check, and I think Lenin believes this. Chomsky says Lenin's bullshitting to get in power, and then he really had this like nefarious plan. I think he actually believed this stuff. When they actually take power, then the cold hard reality of what it means to run a state actually comes upon them. And then when this happens, they have to go to what they called war communism, so to speak, where, okay, we've got to bureaucratize everything, create this giant red army with millions and millions of people, some of which they literally forced peasants into the army to fight the counter-revolution. And then, then after they win they put down the counter-revolution, they go, okay, we can take the boot off the neck a little bit of the peasants and the working class now, and we can have, the new economic policy or whatever, and things start kind of normalizing. Lenin dies, Stalin comes to power, and they go, well, wait a second, like, we got our ass handed to us in the First World War. If we don't sort our shit out, the next time we go to war with
we should rein in it a little bit, because this is going in many, many different branches.
No, let me finish my point, because I'm going to land, and then I want to hear what you're going to say. So Stalin comes to power, and he's faced with a choice. That's an incredibly difficult choice, which is, I can either abuse the fuck out of my population, but maybe when we go to war with Germany or Japan or whatever, we win. Or I can not abuse my population, and then when we go to war, we can get our ass handed to us. And Stalin takes the decision, and I don't envy Stalin. He takes the decision, okay, I'm going to abuse the fuck out of my population. I'm going to go collectivize the peasants' farms. I'm going to force them into brutal working conditions. I'm going to militarize the production, and then we're going to do this crazy industrialization process. And you know what? It worked. They fucking beat the Nazis, right? But the cost, how many people went to gulags? How many people got shot? Like, millions of people died in order to sacrifice to get that done. And this, to me, is reality. This fanciful BS in Marx about communism, this is just nonsense. And when you say that China is communist, I don't see it. I see China as a very competent state.
The issue here, though, is that we have made a lot of particular concrete assumptions on the basis of a very, very broad and I may say very reckless kind of view of the history you just described. So point by point, I'll try to just address what you said based on what I remembered. The first thing I remember you saying, before you said the thing about war communism, what did you say first initially? That you think I was talking
about Lenin's State and Revolution.
Okay. So that's where you began. Yeah. Lenin's State and Revolution may have the actual folding of history may have, I guess, made his expectations more realistic, but the way you've described it is just blatantly not true. So the expectation of very intellectuals and artistic classes and cultural classes that, oh yes, we're going to have the revolution, we're going to be very generous about abolishing higher. Well, I think most Bolsheviks at the time would consider this a kind of ultra-left deviation. It's kind of a dizziness of the success of the revolution. The fact of the matter is that the Bolsheviks, I mean, you have to understand the people you're talking about. These were hardened people who understood the cold, sobering realities of life more than anyone else at their time. They were in Siberian camps. They were professional revolutionaries. So these are not soft snowflakes who are just, faced with harsh, cruel realities. People, the leading Bolsheviks, people like Lenin, always understood these realities to be harsh from the very beginning. So war communism was not some drastic. Lenin understood that the proletarian dictatorship was the dictatorship of one class against another. This is before he seized power. They had no delusional expectations that they were going to seize power and immediately create a nice communist society. And I think you've misinterpreted the meaning of Marx's words here. You've made a lot of assumptions about, like the process Marx is describing to arrive at this fund that would arrive, not to. It's a very important distinction, that would arrive.
I don't think I'm misunderstanding anything. I mean, you haven't explained to me how.
Well,
you haven't responded to my critique of economic reductionism, for one.
Okay, yeah, that was the first thing you said. I'll get there. I just want to talk again about the Stalin thing you mentioned. You said Stalin was going to treat his own population like shit. Although the collectivization resulted in a catastrophic famine, as all forms of the modernization of agriculture across the entire history of humanity have, and compared to those, the ones that happened in Europe and the human costs of European modernization, all of the deaths combined of China and the Soviet Union are extremely modest, and in terms of their brutality and violence and so on and so on. So I don't think we should bring this up and repeat these kind of black legends when it has no explanatory value. The fact of the matter is that the path Stalin pursued of socialism in one country and the industrialization, first of all, was not based on the militarization of agriculture. This was Trotsky's plan for super-industrialization. Stalin's plan it wasn't his specific plan, but the promotion of the collective farm as a model for the industrialization.
I get what he's saying, but I don't like this characterization. Like, even assuming we take the comparison on its face, I don't like this comparison because when we're talking about industrialization in the context of the Soviet Union or China, we're talking about states that already have the methods of that development already before them. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to normatively compare the sort of organic development of these things and the kind of blind way in which they evolved historically with these forms of development as a policy, right? Because in the latter case, we can deliberately alter that to offset the number of deaths. Now, granted, he says that the number of deaths was relatively modest. I don't know how many deaths would have resulted from them not doing that, but we do know efficiently how many were caused by it, roughly, and there were a lot. So I don't think this is a particularly strong defense. I get what he's saying, like it is a defense, and it does make sense, but I don't think it's strong.
Of the economy so that agriculture can finally support the industrialization of the Soviet Union. This was not demilitarization. The collective farms had a good degree of autonomy compared to the top-down state sovkhozes and the institutions that were directly controlled by the state. So this is just patently not true. Now, the question of economic reductionism is also a misunderstanding. You are assuming that Marxism is a kind of metaphysics in which we explain the world before us in terms of some kind of absolute essence. And you think that this essence is the economic relations. But the significance of economic relations as it concerns Marx and Engels is not as some kind of fundamental substance of all reality, but as the deeper essence, in a sense of an essence that is not already superimposed with a specific form. So to be clear by what that means, Marx and Engels acknowledge all of the spiritual, geopolitical, political, and so on realities. They are not substituting those realities for economic relations. They are just saying, what is the manner by which these realities actually, in real reality, how do they actually reproduce themselves? Like, how do they actually, you can even look at this from a kind of perspective of Aristotelian metaphysics, like how are they actually being? How are they actually reproducing their existence? And all that they have done is introduced this question for the first time in the examination of history, where historians, as they noted, had always ignored this question. How is it that human beings really do reproduce themselves in a given historical epoch? We should, and they're saying we're not going to just reduce this to the ideas and the things that they have and the ways that they're conceptualizing and conceiving this. So this is not a form of economic reductionism whatsoever, because it's just a question of how are they actually reproducing themselves, not what necessarily causes. The question of causation is latent with the baggage of Anglo-Saxon metaphysics from the 17th century, which is about cause and effect, some kind of deeper primordial cause or kind of Spinozan substance from which all reality is just the result of, the kind of first cause. That's not, it has nothing to do with the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels or Lenin, Stalin, and Mao for that matter. And if we understand their fundamental ontology, their fundamental philosophical basis of Marxism, it becomes very clear that from Marx to Engels to Lenin to Stalin to Mao to Deng and to Xi, there is a very clear and consistent continuity. It's just not a continuity that can be defined on the basis of a fixed doctrinal form. But the whole point of Marxism...
Well, Mao's separated themselves from fascists by rejecting a command economy and commitment to class struggle. I mean, I don't see how Deng didn't completely overturn this. You know, China's embraced class collaboration, it's embraced nationalism, authoritarianism. You know, they're integrating like a racial conception of nationalism into their conception of the state. I mean, it's like ship of Theseus. Like, at which point does it stop being communist, or do we just have to accept that because Deng is a successor to Mao, that you know whatever he determines is in the Marxist lineage? Well, then it just means nothing.
Like Mussolini can trace himself back to Marx as well. I mean, you could trace Italian syndicalism from Marxism.
Former Marxists.
Okay, I can address what you say, because it's a fair question, right? Why is it that we do not see a clear and overt form of class struggle with not only in the Deng era, but even in the Mao era, right? Because remember, Mao understood there's a patriotic bourgeoisie, there's a patriotic petty bourgeoisie that the Communist Party is trying to align itself with. So, and then you can even go back to Stalin and the era of the Popular Front, and then the people's democracies after World War II. So the reason for that is because we cannot make assumptions about the form that class struggle is going to take. Now, the point of Mao's
why should I believe that this is still class struggle? I mean, they've embraced class collaboration.
No, because I'll explain. Because class struggle is not just, doesn't only take the form of political conflict between different political parties. Class struggle can also take the form of the imminent development of a society in such a way that comes at the expense of certain classes and benefits other classes.
Yeah, that's what fascism did with economic corporatism.
But I don't see how that was in the history of fascism.
What do you mean? There was a gradual, I mean, China went from communism and gradually introduced, market reforms. It became more market oriented, more billionaires, more private ownership. Italy started from a more laissez-faire position, and they gradually transitioned. They had a few years of laissez-faire to kind of build up the economy. It was hugely successful. They had one of the fastest growth rates in Europe. In the 30s, they switched to a more corporatist.
The IRI and the
yeah, sure. I mean, by the mid 30s, like 47% of Italian capital on the stock exchange was owned by the government. And by the time you get to 43 with the Italian Social Republic, it's more socialist than China is today. It's like 74%.
Well,
everything with more than 100 employees.
I can address all three of the points you just raised. So the first one is regarding to the question of the way in which it's the same in Italy. But listen, the key to understanding China and then modern China lies in land reform. Without understanding land reform, there's no meaning to Chinese communism. And by land reform, I mean the fact that despite all of the proletarianization that accompanied Chinese modernization, all the Chinese people still have some kind of social security safety net in the form of these small plots of intensive agricultural plots that they are given and granted by the state to have exclusive cultivation of. And then now with the Xi era, because they want to modernize agriculture more, they're starting to replace that with giving everyone homes, free, basically, housing.
Yeah, I can respond to this.
Single unit apartments. So I just want to this is just kind of the first point.
Yeah, I'll respond to this. And again,
I'll do the two more points.
I mean, you've done like most of the talking on this out of everyone.
Yeah. But it's important to discuss what you said about Italy, because it's interesting because in the interwar years, the form of land ownership from 1900 to 1919 was gradually being taken away from absentee landlords who owned, 80%.
I'm always watching the chat.
80% of the land in Sicily, 65% of the land in Calabria, and elsewhere within Italy. I mean, like, we have an overwhelming monopoly of large landowners who owned all the land. With the rise of the fascist government, the popular uprisings, which were taking this land from the absentee landlords who were using the land for speculative purposes to fund banks that gave loans to industrialists, the fascists crushed these uprisings and returned all the land to the landlords. And the fundamental ownership of the land in Italy did not change in the 1930s. Now, regarding the IRI and the so-called nationalizations, these were akin to bailouts of already bankrupted companies and failed capitalist enterprises, which in a free market economy would have just dissolved and been replaced. The government kept these, they propped them up. The same people who owned them were still in effect running them. It's just the government was claiming it was controlling and owning them. In reality, they were transferring these industrial companies under the control of finance capital. And it's for these reasons that
the government purchasing 74% of the economy is being ruled by finance.
Haas is talking too much. He's got to rein it in. I liked what he was saying earlier, like, let's rein this into like a specific, but he's again, like, I hate talking about like the stupid debate strategy stuff, but in this context, saying too much is as bad as saying too little. Because as soon as the audience's eyes start to glaze over, they will be all too ready to accept his opponent packaging it as, this is a thing we can disregard. Now I'm going to give my argument, right? So he needed to be more concise. He needed to like bring this down to a specific point and really make the debate pivot around that, because there's just too much here.
Bullshit, man.
All right, Haz, hold on. One at a time. Wait. Finish up what you're saying, Haz, and then let Keith get in, because I know he's chomping at the bit. So just go ahead and finish up there real quick.
Just to Joel really quick. The devil's in the details. You have to understand what is meant by this ownership. It's more an oversight over, allowing these former capitalists and industrialists to retain their position, which they were not going to because they went bankrupt. So the government bailed them out and called this a form of nationalization. The final thing about the Italian Social Republic, really, really quick, 2 seconds. This was Mussolini's attempt to pander to a population that was already overwhelmingly disposed to socialism and communism, and they saw right through it. So it was a last-ditch effort by Mussolini to win over the trust of the Italian masses, which he failed to do.
All right, now go.
See, that was good. That was a nice, concise argument that made a point that batted Joel down, or at least it seemed to. He needs to do more of that. Joel is as guilty, by the way. I'm not picking on Haas specifically. I'm picking on Haas a little bit because I'm semi-rooting for him here, but...
Go ahead, Keith.
Okay, well, firstly on the land reform, yes, when the fascist governments took over, there was a massive land reform. But again, I feel like you're just ignoring like geopolitical realities. The fascists had this conception that there are proletarian nations like Italy and Germany that are kept underdeveloped by Anglo-American mercantile powers, and that it was necessary to develop productive forces. This is the same kind of thinking as Sun Yat-sen, it's the same kind of thinking as the CCP now. And they put growth and industrialization ahead of these reforms. Mussolini did embrace a kind of qualified laissez-faire when he first came to power, specifically to develop productive forces, and it was successful. But it's not true that there was no land reform. And again, they were constrained
Okay, so notice he cites geopolitical realities and then doesn't talk about geopolitics at all. I hate when people use terms like this and it has no definite content. It's like talking about human nature. Unless you mean something very specific that you're willing to lay out, it's just an elevator word. It's like, this is, look, the stuff I'm going to talk about, this is big, important, double plus good or something. It's geopolitics is going to be politics concerning space, effectively. So that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about economic relations within a political community or even between political communities, but those aren't going to be geopolitical in essence. Those are going to be assuming fixed relations and then, fixed relations between communities, modes of production, yada, yada, yada. Geopolitics is going to be concerned with the politics literally of things like mountains and oceans and deserts, etc.
In such a way that they had to do this gradually. In terms of the nationalization in the 1930s, it's not true that the governance structure didn't change. These companies that were nationalized, they introduced a corporatist governance structure. Labor and capital got equal representation on boards that ran these companies. And when you get into the 40s, there actually is massive land reform. They instituted a bill which is similar to the one you were talking about in China, where uncultivated land and absentee landlords, this land was seized and it was actually dispersed among cooperatives and local farmers. So, I mean, this idea that, well, it was just to placate people at that point. Well, you can say that, but Mussolini considered the Italian Social Republic the true essence of fascism, and he lamented that during his time in power, he'd been held back by conservatives. He had a king that constrained him. I mean, the first fascist government was a coalition government. There was liberals in there, there was leftists. So if you're going to say that, well, the early period where they embraced laissez-faire temporarily to develop productive forces and they were in coalition with liberals.
No, not the politics of geology, the politics of geography. So it's invoked in international relations theory, like you'll be talking about like economic relations between states, but you're going to be emphasizing where they are, what qualities of the actual territory encompass them and feed into their stability or their power or their interests or what have you. Like that's what that means. So like geopolitics would be concerned with, for example, relations between, I don't know, let's say Britain and America or Britain and France qua their identity as a sea power and a land power, something like that.
And he was constrained by the king. That's the true fascism. But then when he had complete total rule in the 40s and he starts nationalizing, he starts doing land reform, he introduces radical social welfare bills that control 74% of the economy. Well, that's fake fascism because he's just trying to placate people. Why would I buy that? Because the latter stage is actually what's representative of early fascist thought. And, all of the early fascists, that's the kind of way that they conceive fascism. I mean, Mussolini appointed Nicola Bombacci, the former head of the Italian Communist Party, as his economics minister in the Italian Social Republic. You're going to say that these people were just duped.
You've got to take into consideration the geopolitical conditions of China as well. Like China was an agrarian society, and so obviously land reform is going to be the first thing that they do. Whereas if you're talking about a far more industrialized kind of nation, like Germany or something under Hitler, it's a completely different set of priorities. That
it would have been suicidal to just do this radical.
You look in at the USSR.
I can contest. I don't want to talk too much, so I just want to briefly address the 2 points because I've been talking a lot. But just really quick. Land reform is the only basis proven by history to have an independent path to industrialization without seizing overseas colonies and in waging wars of aggression against your neighbors to seize their resources. Land reform specifically is the key to industrialization because it allows the surpluses of agricultural production to be directed for the specific purpose of industrialization. Because countries like Italy and Germany were never able to do this, they had to mobilize their entire economy and countries for the purposes of war rather than internal industrial development. So that's the point about land reform. Now, secondly, there wasn't actually any major land reform that distributed the land away from the landowners in the 30s and the 20s. Now, regarding the land reform during the Italian Social Republic, admittedly, my knowledge of the land reform specifically that happened then is a little bit limited. But what I do know about the Italian Social Republic is that the words and the decrees by the government that were happening in fiat, the actual ruling classes and the actual way in which the society was being governed in actual reality were two completely different realities.
That's not true. They nationalized 80 of the biggest companies in Italy. They had 150,000 employees combined.
On paper.
Well, it's sort of like when we did too big to fail bailouts. And that's like the idea that like we nationalized Lehman Brothers or something.
No, it's not. That you can say
It's
that.
not like that at all. Lehman Brothers don't do anything productive.
You can say that.
That's our industry.
No,
Like if we nationalize like General Motors, Ford, like all these like actual things,
Listen,
companies
what
to
we
produce.
bailed out
Italy,
General
Italy
Motors,
never nationalized anything in any meaningful sense. They just allowed these
nationalize the Bank of Italy.
They looted the Italian people to allow these bankrupt companies to have a lifeline when they otherwise in the free
No,
market.
hold on. Okay, so in 1938 in Italy, the state controlled 77% of iron production. Okay, 67%.
What do you mean by control?
It was controlled by the IRI.
But what does that? What do you
It's
mean? What does
state
that
hands.
control mean? I think
It's
that was in the details. Remember, the control is not a direct form of control like in the Soviet Union, where
Okay, so who's controlling it? You know, when all of this is
the IRI is an
directly by a
institution
body
that
belonging
was,
to the state.
by the way, the IRI was an institution that was maintained for the purposes of steel production within Italy long after fascists. I don't know about long; it's relative, but it was continued through the 50s and the 60s. It actually remained as an
Yeah,
institution.
up to the year 2000.
And it was mainly a kind of financial organ that didn't actually directly control anything. It just was an organ that was directed for the purposes of fulfilling a certain industrial policy and industrial aim.
Okay, and who was it acting on behalf of, if not the state?
It was. The IRI was acting on behalf of the state.
Okay, well, how is that any different from China? China has like private banks, but they own most of the shares. That's the same thing as the IRI. Italy had the state body that can.
I don't like this because they're comparing the policies of a fascist state with an avowedly socialist state. And that really shouldn't be where the debate is focused on, because these are both going to be states. They're going to be reacting to exigencies in time. They're going to be using tried and true policies found elsewhere. Like there's too. It's sort of like when you hear people talking about like the wars of religion, quote unquote, and you hear about like all of these like Christian societies doing all these horrible hypocritical things. Meanwhile, they're still running states, and imputing that to the religion. And I mean, like, they definitely use the religious culture as a means to, again, like, because it was the religious culture of the states involved, in order to, maintain the state. But they were still nonetheless acting as, again, the heads of a state. So it's just a silly comparison to impute that specifically to the religious aspect, when the state, like the actual, the entity defined by its capacity for violence, was still at play. Anyways, we'll keep going.
Control most of the shares of these companies and nationalize some of them.
But the difference is that all of the Chinese companies that exist now have been emerged and developed from the ground up, from the soil of the Chinese.
Yeah, well, they
people.
had different.
That's because China was starting with fuck all to
starting
begin
from
with.
different places.
Yeah.
They're like
Well,
they're in
the obvious
middle of
point
Europe.
is
They're up against these mercantile powers.
Listen,
trying to
when we
develop a
Marxists,
proletarian
but
nation.
when we
And they're
Marxists
going from a market economy to socialism.
But listen, you have to
rather than
understand,
from socialism to more market economy.
The difference, though, is that if these companies are coming and emerging from the soil of the Chinese people, that means the state was overseeing not only what these companies are doing, but where their actual development. It was actually responsible for where they came from and their emergence in the first place. So it's not the same thing. And the second thing that's important to understand here is the fact that the reason Marxists say that fascism was the emergency organ of industrial and finance capitalists wasn't because we believe that they directly controlled fascists or even funded the majority of the fascist resources, but precisely because these social formations and these economic structures, which would have otherwise not existed and would have been wiped out as a result of the crisis in 29, they were allowed to retain a lifeline because of fascism. Whereas in China, for example,
why should I believe that there was Germany and Italy were supposedly on the precipice of a communist revolution? Why didn't it happen in England or?
I don't think they were on the precipice of a communist revolution. I don't believe they were.
Okay, so what was going to happen in 1929 that didn't happen in Britain or France or Spain?
Britain, I'll tell you, Britain, France, and Spain, and the United States, all embarked on quasi-corporatist and socialistic policies to save their economies as well. So I don't know what you're really asking.
If fascism goes socialist, it's it's in the aid of capitalism, because there surely would have been like a greater proper socialist revolution.
No, it's not that there would have been a socialist revolution, but there would have probably been an economic restructuring of the economy in some kind of way. Like new companies would have emerged at the expense of old ones, and new order would have emerged at the expense.
Well, who cares if it's
Logo's just in the corner, just stroking his beard like Saruman in a hoodie.
new company or it's just an old one, if the state is taking it over and introducing a corporatist governance structure and giving labor equal representation and directing the direction of the company. I mean, it's like, okay, fine. So these capitalists in China, they developed while the CCP was in charge, and if Jack Ma steps out of line, they'll throw him in jail. Well, what's the difference? I mean, yeah, Germany had already existing capitalists.
The difference is that,
and if they stepped out of line,
it's precisely. I'll explain it to you. I'll explain it to you. It's very simple, actually. The difference is precisely the fact that the fascist countries are two corporatist in a kind of political sense of the word. They did not have the sufficient degree of control over these companies to be able to completely wholesale reform and open up economies, eliminate industries, completely reform and change everything about their economy from the bottom up. The Chinese state now does have the power to do that because it gets
and after all the reform, they
totally
ended up
different
back with
context.
the corporatist system.
How long has the
They
CCP
ended
been
up
in?
back with
The CCP's
fascism
been in
anyway.
Listen, right now,
CCP's been in for 7.
That's pointing to an ethical issue, though. That's not pointing to a structural issue. So I think Haas actually might have something of a point there, in that you can judge it however you like, but as a consequence of its specific history, the Chinese state actually has a level of control over its own form and content that almost no other state does. The United States government can't reform itself from the, at the level of the structure, because it will result in civil war and the dissolution of the thing. That's not, at least like in terms of its constitution per se. It may actually be too weak to do this, but there don't appear to be any actual sort of constitutional limits to that. President Sunday does really love tea, doesn't he? I am deathly sick right now. So, Logo is near useless in this debate. Frankly, I think that's probably wise on his part, because if he comes out, Haas is perfectly willing and able to contradict his own teammate in the context of the debate. So he may just have good survival instincts. He also just might not be, like, my impression of Logos is that, or Logo, what do we call him? Do we call him Logo Daedalus or Daedalus or Logo or what? Just call him Logo. The problem with Logo is that he seems to have like a really good grounding in theory, but I don't think he's probably like me in that regard. He doesn't have the historical chops to take part in this debate in particular. Like, I couldn't drum up half of these facts. This would have taken a lot of preparation, and maybe he just didn't do that, because he may have been anticipating, like I was, that this was going to be a polemic debate about whether or not China was fascist as like a negative. But it appears as if the argument here is actually a bit more interesting. So Keith Woods and Joel Davis are trying to argue that China is closer to fascism, and that's connected to its success. I dispute that simply on the grounds, again, that we're simply talking about China engaging in, as a state, engaging in the activity of a state. And of course, fascism in various forms presumes the deification of the state in loose terms, not in the sense of like making the state God, but in the sense of like the state ends up being the final end of the community, as it were. Again, like it's massive inheritance from Hegel, which is one of the reasons why so many socialists and fascists found common cause at one point. Logo is the most interesting person there, and he barely said anything. I think, again, in his defense, this is like a super particular historical argument that I don't have the ability to judge. And he probably doesn't have the ability to judge either. It's actually like a fairly boring argument, I think. Like, it's interesting, but at the same time, like, the stakes are so low. The question that they're fighting over is basically, does China's activities approximate really to what we would expect from an idealist communist state versus a fascist state that has existed in reality? And it seems obvious that it's going to be the latter, simply because, again, it has existed in reality. People, including people in power, will always tend to follow the path of least resistance. And they do. So, Canada's entire identity is that they are not America. Canada's entire identity is that we are a between space between other nations. And in fact, the history of the emergence of the concept of a nation state directly implicates Canada's role as a kind of filter, as like a border filter. I've got a whole video on it called The Con of the Nation State. You should watch it. It's really good. I think, anyways.
70 years, they started with an agrarian society.
Right now in the Xi era, there's a fundamental restructuring. And I'm saying the reason why the Chinese state is able to do this is because it gets its mandate directly from the small-scale land holding or apartment holding, whatever, the Chinese people. That is where it gets its mandate. That is its sole authority. The Xi era is being characterized by this complete transformation of the various industries and sectoral interests and so on of the Chinese economy that is coming at the expense of, there's no corporatism here between class collaboration. Classes are being eliminated wholesale because of the government's 5-year plans and policies, and they can't do anything about it. The government doesn't have to compromise with any classes. It doesn't have to negotiate with them. It will pursue an industrial policy, and it will pursue a developmental policy solely according to the interests of the Chinese people.
Capitalists were completely left out of the decision-making policies in that.
It's not.
Germany.
what I just said, though. That's not relevant
That's
to
not
what
true
I said.
about Germany, etc. Like a lot of that stuff, like really, like why did Ford like have to create a like sub spin-off brand for Nazi Germany? That was due to American policies. It was not that like Germans had no problem with Ford running plants with American like out of America in Germany.
Okay, so that proves that capitalists were direct in the National Socialists.
I'm
So I
saying
guess
that they didn't have a
BlackRock
problem
was
with it.
direct
I'm saying that the
in the CCP then.
change. I'm saying that the change was not determined from within their society. It was determined within ours.
Like, so let's see, which country has more Wall Street dollars in it? National Socialist Germany or fucking China? I think China by like billions and billions and
Yeah, yeah.
billions.
Well, the reason for that is
70% of the Chinese economy is privatized at this point. It's like in terms of like actually has like
90% of
capitalists.
exports are private.
what
Yeah,
do you mean by private, though?
That there's someone called a capitalist who invests in the company and gets surplus value, like in response for their investment.
That's not what private means. Private specifically means that it's a protected sphere against the interventions of the public body, which is, of course, the state authority. So that's a mistaken distinction. Public and private. The reason why, again, we talk about liberalism both in ethical and in economic terms is precisely because that kind of referral to legitimacy as being embodied in the personal contracting out of your rights, as well as of the limitations of the state's ability to, shall we say, demand of you a certain kind of action insofar as it violates certain rights. That directly corresponds to the idea that there is a sphere of human activity that should not be impinged upon by the public. He's characterizing capitalism, not liberalism. Capitalism may require liberal ideology or liberal structures as a condition of its emergence, but this is not a good characterization of the private as opposed to the public.
You know,
I don't even.
are you
think
fucking
that-
Marxist?
Yeah, but that doesn't even really describe capitalist countries anymore. So it's really not true.
What do you mean it's not true? Are you telling me that aren't people called investors in China who invest in stock in China that make money off that stock?
If you're talking,
like,
are you talking
according
about,
to Marx, that's
if
the cap.
Okay, so they deviated from the question. I wish Has had pushed back on that because he's not describing the private. He is describing capitalist, and indeed there are capitalists in China, and China engages in capitalism as an entity by itself. But that's not a good response.
if you're talking about financial derivatives and speculation, it is heavily restricted.
I'm talking about buying stock. I'm buying stock, buying trading stock.
I think for individuals, it's actually restricted within China. You can't just speculate on the stock market.
Yeah, it's like an institutional thing. You have to like basically. That's like your.
Yeah, so exactly. So it's not private. That's crucial. This isn't like, by the way, this isn't like China standing. I have a lot of problems with China, but they're correct.
Job. It's like that's your job in the state. It's
Yeah,
like
you
the
can't
state's
just do that
capitalist.
freely.
So I don't know what is that.
Yeah, but okay, so you can't do it free. So they basically protect a certain class of capitalists and only let them do it.
They're state
No,
servants.
no, they're
There's literally like.
Oh,
civil
is it-
servants.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, man,
well,
I'd love to be a
Germany
billionaire
were
state servant.
servants.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're state servants, and maybe it's very corrupt, but they're not private. That's the distinction. Capitalist and private, like these terms have a meaning besides the negative associations we have with them, right? And that cuts both ways. Like their characterization of fascists, similarly, is, and they argue this themselves, it doesn't simply bear the content of the historical weight that we associate with our loose use of fascism as effectively a political slur. Whether or not that's appropriate, I think it largely is. That's what they're banking on in order to make their argument. So this is there's some inconsistency here, and again, like that, just leaving all that aside, that's just not an appropriate characterization of the private. The private does not refer to the fact that individuals engage in investment. It refers to whether or not they can do so if they do so privately, as opposed to if this is a part of their, if this is a right that is only conferred by their role as a civil servant or as a public servant, then it's not private.
Yeah, that's good, right? But it comes with a trade-off, right? It comes with a trade-off because your billions, all of that money, if you're Jack Ma, you don't have
you don't control
that a capitalist has in America.
So let me explain it to you.
I'm still billion.
You can buy ownership stock in a Chinese company. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I think I can't verify the particular. I mean, I could. I just haven't yet. I can't verify the particular arguments that they're making here. However, given the facts that they are throwing at each other, given what's been said as like the terms of the discussion, what Joel has described isn't private. So
Let's say you're a billionaire within China, right?
How
Billionaires
does that not apply to Germany?
let's say you're a billionaire within China, right? Billionaire is going to be your net worth. It's going to be your total holdings. In China, you are not free to just liquidate that wealth and do what you want with it. It's your wealth is being controlled.
Sure, you got a fucking nice car, nice house, sexy wife.
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
living well.
Okay.
Listen,
What's wrong with civil servants doing
Marx?
that?
I'm not the fucking communist in this conversation. I got no problem with it.
Joel,
I'm a communist. I'm saying
hold on.
Italy had a reform that foreigners couldn't buy
Let's-
stocks in Italian companies.
like that little slip that women are property in this.
That's fine, but let's go back to Marx here. And Marx's critique of the Gotha program. What you're describing is inequality. Some people have nice cars and nice houses, and some people don't.
I don't get how.
No, what I'm describing is the capitalist mode of production. That's what I'm describing.
No, you're describing the cultural phenomena of inequality. But Marx himself
Is
described.
there surplus value or not?
But Marx, we can talk about surplus value later. But Marx himself described within the critique of the Gotha program that in a socialist society, inequality will still prevail. And Lenin described the same thing because you will be compensated on the basis of your work, right? According to your work. But people have different degrees of being able to do different kinds of work because of contingencies. So that's how Chinese Marxists will explain it. Some people
Now that strikes me as a little bit suspect because earlier he was characterizing socialism as being a system without money, but it seems like you must have some way to actually track, disparities of earnings in an abstract way. So, this is not really that important, but that doesn't seem to rub that the right way.
contingent reasons. It's almost like an American capitalist talking point you hear. Like they worked harder, and they got more money, right? It's different from just being a capitalist per se, because a capitalist presupposes the institution of private property first and then the profits later. It's not based on your labor. So
Yeah, I understand that it's
it's
technocratically
very
administered.
difficult. I would argue that it's collectively.
All of this applies to National Socialist Germany. I mean, they brought in a wage leveling law that restructured wages so that it was based on the effort of the worker rather than anything else. Changed 97% of wages.
That's for wages, though. That's not for the industrial capitalist and financial capitalist class that was still.
Okay, so what the impasse they're running into again is that I'm actually was a little bit impressed that Logo was able to keep up with that. So Logo and Haas are arguing at the level of the composition of the community, like at the structural level. Keith and Joel are arguing in terms of similarities of policy, and these actually don't bear on each other. There's a whole level of analysis that they're just overlooking.
It is, yeah. Germany's economy.
Yeah, they lowered their wages. They were.
They literally nationalized the whole, like so much of the
But
banking
listen,
system.
they're not getting paid.
you're
They're not getting
wrong
paid
on that.
wages. They're not a wage-earning class primarily. They're a class that earns their money through profit.
These Chinese billionaires are not a wage-earning class either.
I didn't say they were.
Yeah, well, exactly. So what's the fucking difference?
Well, the point he brought up wasn't specifically relevant because the underlying point I'm trying to say here is that there's no corporatism. There's no negotiating with any segment of the CCP does not share power with any class or segment of Chinese society. It is solely accountable to the Chinese people.
Now, what is their
So that was actually well put. So again, the point is that it's not corporatism because these investors and whatnot, these aren't like separate entities that the state is doing business with as private corporations. These are a part of the state itself. They're civil servants. That's the whole point. So that was well said by Haas.
Let me ask a question.
Authoritarian workers' vanguard. I mean, that's fascism.
I'm gonna ask a question
it's the reason why it's a proletarian dictatorship is because the proletariat is only meaningful within this wider context of the people as a whole. The reason why it's a proletarian dictatorship is because the proletariat is the class that emerged, that was uprooted from its means of subsistence and its means of production. And the proletarian dictatorship is specifically attuned to allowing the Chinese people to endure revolutions in the forces of production, which will inevitably uproot them from their original means of production. The smallholder agriculture is being uprooted, and Xi is responding to that. Instead of throwing these people on the street and leaving them with nothing, like in a capitalist society, they're getting free.
All right, let me ask.
Yeah, this is the most calm I've seen Haas. I think that was very wise on his part. I've noticed something with Haas that he is extremely sensitive to people speaking to him condescendingly or putting on airs or what have you, and he can handle quite a bit and keep his cool. He can be pretty amicable so long as you treat him with respect, is my general impression. And I think so far that's been the case. I think Joel's kind of pushing it a little bit, but yeah, this is actually a pretty strong performance by Haas, all things considered.
Let me ask you a question. I'm gonna let you talk some more. I'm asking you a question, so you'll still get to talk. Now, you mentioned earlier that there is a continuity between going all the way back to Marx to Xi, the guy you just mentioned. What is that continuity? If you want to get super specific, you can. But I think that's pretty simplified.
I don't want to ramble, but I would describe it to simplify it concretely. It's the dialectic between form and content. So for Marx, this originally takes the form of the whole structure, apparatus, or whatever you want to call it, the project of German idealism, culminating in Hegel's system. For Marx, the real content of this system, the real truth of the insight of Hegel lies in the material reality
Watch the eyes of the interlocutors as this goes on. Notice where they're going. Notice which eyes move and which ones don't.
of the proletariat. So this is the first way in which Marx initiates his kind of discovery. Real human, and then in the case of Feuerbach has an imagined humanity, right? He's a humanist, but his human is idealized. Marx says, no, this is humanity is no idle abstraction of the imagination. Humanity is a real and determinate humanity, specifically as it takes the form of the proletariat. Then Lenin comes, and Lenin is dealing with the institution of European social democracy, and he's trying to bring this into Russia. So, and Lenin discovers that the real essence of this institution of the party form cannot actually be found in the ready-made forms legislated by the party itself, but must be, you must delve deeper and deeper into the ground, into the soil of the Russian peasantry, right? So it's this, and then you can keep going with Stalin. Stalin doesn't actually call himself an innovator of Marxism. He just says he's the most faithful servant of Lenin. And Stalin's collectivization and his wager upon the Russian middle peasants is an extension of Lenin's fundamental discovery. And then Mao continues this by almost eliminating the significance of the industrial proletariat altogether and recognizing that the fundamental class differentiations are to be found in the Chinese people, specifically the Chinese peasants more generally. So then Mao is this more kind of populist contribution. Then with Deng Xiaoping is the final nail in the coffin to the Soviet, the legacy of the Soviet-inspired system of central planning, which actually Mao was always in tension with and contradicting from the very beginning. Sorry, there's kind of an echo. So with Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, the real innovation and insight of Maoism, which is striving away from this kind of top-down, centralized, or overly centralized kind of institutionalized, bureaucratic Soviet system where everything is just planned, to a system that actually develops socialism from the soil of the Chinese people themselves. And now with the Xi era, after the development of the forces of production, we are now opening into a new era of an authentic communist morality. So the question remains, now that we have develop the forces of production, what is the aesthetic, cultural, so on and so on? What values will define the orientation of the development of the forces of production? And this kind of spiritual orientation is what defines the Xi era. So
that's just so like ironic to me because like as you guys are like, you love Hegel and you love Marx, and it's just the way you describe that, it's almost like I'm listening to Giovanni Gentile or some shit, because with Hegel, you got this move from the concrete subject to the abstract object. And then Marx flips out on his head with his materialism, right? You have the concrete object, you move to the kind of abstract subject.
To the concrete.
Yeah. And so this, but Hegel in the philosophy of right, I mean, I don't like Hegel's metaphysics that much, but the philosophy of right I find profound, where you have this kind of distinction between this like classical distinction that goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy, like in Western political thought, really, between this polarity between anarchy and tyranny. On the one hand, you have this notion of like, the free conscience, the self-actualization of the individual, but if you just kind of, what's the dude's name? Max Stirner is like, just going all in on that. You just become. Well, the other direction is you have this notion of like, the collective good, the legal and moral principles of the political. But if you completely negate like the individual's role, then you're a tyrant.
I have no idea what the hell he just said. If you completely negate the individual's role, you're a tyrant. The whole distinction between tyranny and like a proper archonship, or what was the actual term? I can't remember. I'll have to reread Bates's book at some point. He goes into detail on that. But the whole distinction is that a tyrant is somebody who doesn't rule by religious right, and is one of the few cases where individual masses can directly like feed their decisions into a political change, which is one of the reasons why all of the democratic revolutions that took place that gave us the seeds of the modern political form, or that would become the modern political form over time, were the results of the actions of tyrants. Because proper like archons would have been inherently, in some key respects, there were exceptions, of course, especially when they were trying to address crises emerging from contradictions within their political systems. They would be inherently conservative. They would be concerned with maintaining the institutions that exist as they are, because that would be in the interest, again, of the land-holding citizenry. So, stop negating. Whose role am I negating? I'm confused.
And Hegel says, okay, we've got to find some kind of sublation of this dichotomy. We've got to kind of synthesize these things together, and so it becomes the kind of voluntary identification with, of the individual with the collective good. Now, Hegel is a libtard, so he has this kind of defense of Enlightenment liberalism.
He's
a little
Republican.
bit.
He's not.
Yeah,
He's a Republican.
whatever.
All the time.
Hegel is not a liberal. Hegel takes a lot from Rousseau. Like, there's a strong liberal element in there in the sense of, again, like the emergence of sort of community relations and state relations cited within the individual consciousness, but like genealogically. But no, Hegel's not a liberal. Like, the earliest forms of fascism are Hegelian. It's not. No. No. This is. I'm just at a loss for words. That was bad. President Sunday is the real tyrant. He negates our role in any votes. He's even said his channel isn't a democracy. Yeah, but I'm not a tyrant. I'm the rightful king of this channel. That's the difference. And that's why you will never have any rights here.
The point is, this notion of this notion of the identification as would have been understood in Hegel's day is within this bourgeois liberal context. Whereas when you get to the 20th century, obviously we live in mass society, the effects of mass production. There's a completely different kind of conception of civil society at this point. We don't have this kind of elite bourgeois civil discourse. Now we have like this mass-produced kind of inundation of ideological kind of imposition by this kind of mass media system. And this is the context out of which fascism, communism and progressivism, they all kind of rise in this early 20th century, and so-called mass democracy. And in this context, Gentile comes along as a respecter of Marx and Hegel, and he says, okay, so in order to like achieve this synthesis between the individual and the collective, there needs to be an identification with the kind of spiritual mission of the state. And you can see, Mussolini talk about that the conception of the state ultimately is religious in fascism, that there is a kind of, and this is not done in a way that just completely negates Marx either, but it's this kind of synthesis of the idea that the subject is not just an individual unto himself as in the kind of classical Enlightenment conception, but instead the subject kind of actively constructs himself in his self-actualization within within like his relation to the spiritual idea of the state. Now, this is why I kind of respect the Chinese, in a profound way, because you can see that there's this kind of authenticity that they're trying to strive towards which is why I also respect the cessation of this kind of class struggle nonsense and this striving toward this concept of the national idea as ultimately the kind of basis for its legitimacy. But like to me, there's so much. I don't understand how you guys can just sit there and not see like there's a massive amount of convergence between what was going on in Italy with these fascist intellectuals in the early 20th century and the developments in Chinese thought the last few decades.
Yeah,
you can say, there's little subtle differences.
Way things could have gone. Things could have gone differently, but the thing is, right, is like in actual material history, like who did the fascists like decide that their ally was? Did they decide to ally with the Soviet Union and the forces of communism? Because if they had, they probably would have been able to.
I think I can actually
the Anglo-Atlantic world.
Yeah,
but
and also
this is where geopolitics comes in, though, because Germany.
It's not about ideology here.
Germany was not in the same position that China was in. Like we all talk about land reform and how like when Mao first comes to power, the Soviets send over, this is what we did with Stalin. You guys should try this, command economy. They tried for a bit and go, this is fucked. We're not doing this.
Yeah, I can
because the Chinese didn't have to do it because they weren't in the same geopolitical stress that the Russians were in, and also the Germans. The Germans knew if we don't. The kind of Lebensraum kind of concept in National Socialist ideology. That's a geopolitical concept that predates National Socialist ideology by decades. And basically the idea, the Germans knew if we don't expand this state militarily into the east, and gain new territory, we're going to get cucked by America. We're going to get
because they couldn't do land reform. Because they didn't do land reform.
They didn't have land. Like it wasn't in the same capacity as.
They didn't want. They didn't
have time. They didn't have time. They had to go from 0 to 100 like that. They had to build a war machine like that.
Soviet Union had time. The
Soviet Union, yeah, the Soviet Union, as I said, brutalized their people as well to create. I mean, like the
It's not just about land reform. I mean,
the kulaks in Chile,
resources.
the kulaks already liberated.
Germany cooperated with the Soviet Union peacefully, then both of their developmental needs could have been reached without those tragedies. Germany's technical expertise could have helped develop the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union's resources could have fulfilled the needs of the German industrialization. So they didn't. But I just wanted to go back.
The Japanese didn't declare war, didn't bomb Pearl Harbor, but like invaded Russia from the other side.
I think here's an important distinction though that we have to draw. I think between, because you mentioned Gentile and stuff. I just want to talk briefly about that. I think the most important distinction here is that for Marx, the issue is not so much the contradiction between the individual and the collective. The issue is really, this is the crux of the contradiction between the state and the civil society. Marx's entire point is that Hegel's civil society is an imagined civil society that does not fundamentally, and like Hegel's idea is basically like, here you have the state and it must reconcile itself and be harmonious with its origins and its real foundations in the civil society. As Marx pointed out, though, the two actually do enter into contradiction with each other in such a way that the state becomes annihilated in civil society. And this was actually the fate of Prussian constitutional monarchy, or monarchy itself, is that it was annihilated because of what was going on in the imminent development of civil society. The distinction with fascism, though, that's relevant here is that despite what you might think and what we're taught by Cold War propaganda, communist states are not total states. And what I mean by that is that these are states that are cognizant of their own imminent limitation, their own inability to permanently conquer their origins and their material basis in civil society. And that's why I say the only contract that the CCP is going to negotiate with is the Chinese people, because in contrast to the kind of Mussolini idea that the state and the people are one and they're actually the same thing, China recognizes, and the Soviet Union also recognizes in its own way, that the state and the people are not actually always already the same thing. There is a contradiction between them, and the state must acknowledge its own limitation in this regard. This is why, for example, with Stalin's collectivization, the kolkhozes are not state-owned property. They are actually collective farms owned and property of the collective farm. There, Stalin must acknowledge, and Stalin writes this in his Economic Problems of the USSR, which is, this is why we have a socialist commodity. This is why we need prices. This is why commodities persist, because we cannot just go to the peasants and just loot and steal all of their land and their resources. It belongs to them. We, the state, cannot make it state property because this would amount to a form of robbery of the peasants.
I just want to say something
this is pure ideology
before we move off.
This is pure ideology because the reality in Russia was obviously, like for many centuries, the peasantry of Russia was under the boot of the gentry.
No, but otherwise it was collectively owned for most of the Russian peasantry owned the land collectively.
Okay. By the way, I don't know I can't verify what Haz is saying because I haven't read this stuff. But when Zizek says pure ideology, what he's saying is not that the thing that you are saying is the result of propaganda. What he is saying is that your categories and your ability to identify stuff in the world and the way you evaluate them is downstream from a super real, what's the word I want to look for here? It's downstream from a super real, like, matrix of concepts that are imposed upon you, God knows where from, right? The point is that these aren't like, there isn't a careful logical progression wherein which you honestly determine what is in the world and then identify things in the world by reference to this framework that you have built. You're handed down a bunch of assumptions. A bunch of assumptions not just about the things that there are, but the kinds of things that can be, things like that.
Yeah, they were liberated by the Tsar already, like in many cases, in many cases, like at least partially. But then once you get the degeneration of the Russian political system, in World War I, where everything goes to shit, prior to the Bolsheviks seizing power, the peasants basically were basically liberated at this point. They completely.
You're talking about Stolypin reforms. There were Stolypin reforms, which
but not even talking about reforms at this point. Like by the time when the Bolsheviks first seized power, they didn't even have control of the rural areas. Like they it was a proletarian revolution, right? So they had control of the urban areas, but they had very limited control of the rural areas. And basically, the rural areas were like law unto themselves. They were in many cases they didn't really have any good enough incentive to participate in the Soviet
the Bolshevik Revolution was possible because the Bolsheviks promised land reform, and the soldiers.
No. This is bullshit. This is absolute bullshit. It was a proletarian revolution. The peasants reluctantly went along with it because they were like, oh fuck, we don't want the aristocracy coming back.
No, the only reason the Bolsheviks succeeded is because they didn't promise and initiate a program of land reform, which the soldiers and sailors and those people who did come from peasant families and backgrounds were very responsive to and recipient to. And as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution, large noble and proprietary estates were divided and given to the peasants.
I'm pretty sure the peasants everyone's kind of happy being left alone, not Stalin showing up with a bunch of dudes from the cities right? to point guns in people's faces and force them to do shit on their own land.
Most of them had the land in common in some kind of way already when it was redistributed. But the second thing is, as a result of the Stolypian reforms, there was a form of specific individual land ownership. And this gave rise to the kulak, but it was an artificial invention of the Stolypian reforms that was not an organic feature or character of the Russian peasantry or the Russian people. And that's why the kulaks posed such an issue for.
Oh yeah, so sending a bunch of like dudes in from the city with fancy uniforms to start running these farms bureaucratically, like be like this like managerial class come in and like oppress them and like take all their shit.
It was an extremely violent thing that happened. It was extremely oppressive, extremely violent.
Yeah, but it's totally it's antithetical.
Joel, but all I'm going to insist upon is a crucial difference, that this is the foundation of all modern industrial and modernity in general to begin with. And this violence will either happen in your own country. I mean, hopefully now we're at a state we don't need this anymore because the differences in the concentration of capital. We have China now, which can help develop countries so they don't have to go through this. But this is the hidden origin of modernity itself. If it's not going to be your own country, it's going to be someone else.
I said at the beginning, I didn't criticize Stalin. I said Stalin was presented with pretty much an impossible choice.
All right, now let me put a pin in this. Let me let Keith get in there because I let you guys go long, and I know he wanted to talk like.
I just want to say something like, because Logo dropped in this thing. Oh well, the fascists, they chose to like ally with capitalist powers and they went after the Soviet Union. I mean, I think everything Logo's dropped in so far is just like straight up wrong. Like it's just like basic bitch like communist myths.
Well, what's wrong about that?
What's wrong about that? Well, it's not
What's
true.
wrong about like the fact that the fascists presented themselves specifically as anti-communist? Like,
yeah, I'm going to explain. Well, okay, so Hitler throughout the 20s and 30s, most fascists don't get this either, but he always presented.
Why are we talking about Hitler? Hitler was a Nazi. He wasn't a fascist. There's a difference here. Unless are we using fascism in a particular sense or just colloquially? Because I thought that we wanted to particularize fascism to a particular state form, to a specific state form. If we're talking about Nazi Germany, we're not talking about the same thing anymore. They're also playing with fire here. They're starting to get aggressive, and they're getting aggressive with Haas. And I think Joel might be able to keep up with Haas, or at least he seems to have a bit of bluster going on. I don't know about Keith. We'll see.
Anglo-American Jewish capitalism as the primary threat. And the first mention from Hitler of anti-Semitism is the Geimlich letter, and there's no mention of communism in it. He's talking about the Jews directing international capitalism and them identifying more than Jews than their nation state. And when he starts to mention communism, he talks about it as a phenomenon that's directed from Wall Street. And he never mentions communism as a primary threat, except in kind of public speeches and propaganda. But he sees it as a way for international finance capital to weaken nations. Now, in terms of like the invasion of Russia, a lot of the National Socialists in the 1930s, before they got elected, wanted to go ahead with this position of moving forward with an alliance of Russia and focusing on the West. Hitler's reason for rejecting this was purely like geopolitical. You're talking about land reform, but I mean, there was a different conception of like development at that time, and Hitler's very much had this conception of kind of space and race. And his experience of sort of fighting German-descended soldiers in U.S. uniforms in World War I really influenced this. And Hitler believed that if a European power didn't emerge with the kind of scale of the United States, that no one would be able to take on the hegemony of the emerging North American power, as he called it. So Hitler struck east, but it was very much with this long-term thinking that Germany would either become a great power, the magnitude of the US, that could challenge capitalist hegemony over the world, or to be destroyed. And he says this in speeches throughout the 20s and 30s. He contrasts, he compared Germany. He said that the fate of Germany would be like India or Ireland, that would be one of these dispossessed colonial nations. And, his thinking was very much that, it was expansion or destruction. I mean, there's a quote from the Brendan Sims
There's a lot of
biography.
American capitalists who said the same thing, though.
Okay, so Brendan Sims says this is like a popular biography that came out on Hitler recently. He's a pretty respected historian. The crucial point is that Hitler did not primarily justify the quest for Lebensraum with the inherent inferiority of the Slav population there as an ideological war against Bolshevism, or even as a first step towards the annihilation of Jews in Europe. His aim throughout was not world domination, but simple national survival. Hitler may have spoken privately of his hopes for world hegemony, but this was probably bluster. It's more likely that, at least at this stage, Hitler did not envisage world domination by Germany as opposed to world power status necessary for survival. And you also have his second book, which he didn't actually publish because it gave away too much of his geopolitical thinking. But throughout the second book, when he's talking about expanding east, the primary threat throughout is the Anglo-Saxon capitalist powers, as they call them. And again, the line of thinking is that either Germany is going to get enough space to the east to industrialize sufficiently to challenge the United States, or it's going to perish. So, I mean, just like reading ideology into this, I mean, fascists do this as well. Like, oh, is this great crusade against communism? Like, I mean, it's just like juvenile stuff.
Yeah, but okay, so what if, but like, do you think, like, what, okay, so you're saying fundamentally, like, so they weren't primarily anti-capitalist, they were primarily anti-communist, but they just considered communism to be essentially like another hand of the capitalists, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, they were just saying propaganda to justify their geopolitical interests, which was Hitler didn't give a fuck about the Russians.
When they led with the anti-communist stuff, I mean, that's
the choice was okay, like it's us or them. Like either we expand or we die.
Here's the issue. The issue is that there's two things, right? Hitler was very clear that he wanted to divide the world with the British Empire. He admired the British Empire, and he was not against the British Empire per se. Now, I guess he did talk about Anglo-American Jewish capitalists or whatever, but the fact is that Hitler expanded east primarily because he was wanted to make the signal to the Western powers that, hey, I'm just going to go take on the Soviet Union. If you leave me alone, it really doesn't concern you, right? And he thought that he would get away with invading Poland.
Not my wheelhouse, but this is, as far as I am aware, a fairly non-controversial reading. So if somebody wants to comment on that, that'd be very helpful.
And doing all these things and breaking treaties with England and these other countries because he thought that they would just not mind him confronting.
Referring to Haas.
The Soviet Union and going eastward. So, I mean, I don't know what his imagined long-term goal necessarily is. Like, oh, he wants to compete with America or whatever. But concretely, like specifically as it's relevant to the situation there, Hitler was making signals to the Anglo-American ruling classes, whether they're Jewish or otherwise, it doesn't really concern me, that he was going to be their champion against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and Leon Mackenzie King, Prime Minister of Canada, famously shook hands with him, thought he was a swell guy. So yeah, this checks out.
Well, yeah, he wanted to avoid a world war with Britain. But I mean, he still saw capitalism as the primary threat, and he was trying to create a powerful enough state to take that on. I mean,
it was in Germany's interest to go to war with Britain because Britain had nothing to offer Germany. Like,
I know. I don't think Germany wanted to go to war with Britain, but I think, I think that Germany wanted to get away with invading the East, and they thought they would just get away with this. But the problem,
but it's not about ideology. It's not about like, oh, fascism is inherently this, and it's about the cold geopolitical reality of the situation. It was much like Stalin's behavior, much like.
Okay, so again, they'll say stuff like geopolitical reality, and they won't refer to anything having to do with geopolitics. I think they're trying to refer to just like some principle of international relations or something. Same problems, by the way. International relations is a thoroughly ideologically not just saturated but emergent field. Like it requires an extremely uncritical view of the ontology of the state, things like that. But like they're not saying anything. It's like when you watch reactionaries refer to human nature. There's no content there. As if we didn't know for a certainty that we aren't teleologically emergent, that we didn't emerge as a result of natural processes and contingencies.
Mao's behavior, they were able to make different decisions because they had different material historical circumstances.
Here's the thing is that I get it that it was in the interest of the German economy as within the specific political order the Nazis were ruling that yes, they needed more resources and they needed more space to appease the German population, which was not being given a land reform internally. But the reason for that was because the Nazis, you can either say that they were acting on behalf of or they had to compromise with the German monopolists and landowners. The fact stands that this was why they had to, there was an internal.
By the way, a second ago when I was looking at my shelf and I was like, ugh, I was referring to actually my copy of Mein Kampf briefly because I wanted to just check Hitler's treatment of the state again just to measure it with what Woods was saying. And I realized I hadn't touched this thing in like 10 years and it had like bugs crawling inside of it. It's like, ugh. It's like literally like picking up the Necronomicon.
Internal kind of social tension within Germany that they had to mitigate by promising the German people that they're going to get their plot of land and their homestead in the East.
This is also why they failed, because they were beholden to this class. This class didn't give a shit about the Nazis in the first place.
They're not beholden.
Oh yeah, by the way, if any of you like keep books in your house, like a lot of them, make sure you dust your shelves regularly because booklights are not fun. And dehumidifiers. So essential. Leather-bound books are usually okay. Cloth-bound ones will collect mold like nothing else if you're not in a well-ventilated area.
To the class. I mean,
no. Listen. I'm making a point.
Hitler said
no. Let me finish my fucking point. Please, I haven't talked that much.
They wanted to create a classless society in the long run. So I mean, the idea that this was like serving the capitalist class.
Can I finish my point? I'm talking about just cold geopolitical realities here. Okay. So.
Oh, he's doing it too. God damn it. Okay, maybe he'll actually say something specific though.
You're really not.
Hitler's, yes, I am. I'm about to, if you let me. Okay. So
All right, I'll let you.
Hitler's, all of these monopolists, the landowners, basically the ancien regime, like the fucking hereditary aristocracy of Germany at the time, they supported Hitler to a point. But as soon as it, like, as
By the way, Keith Woods doesn't know jack about socialism or Marx. I know this not just because I critiqued his videos and found them to have like no content that actually relates to Marx's argumentation whatsoever, but because way back in the day when he was criticizing the academic agent, I had to write a part of his video for him. Doesn't know jack.
as soon as there was going to be any attempt
And my justification to myself at the time was, hey, you know what? If I actually like infect these people with like a proper understanding of this theory, there might be some positive downstream effects. Evidently not.
land reform in that sense, that is when they collaborated extremely hand in glove with British capitalists, and the like German secret intelligence service was literally all double agents for the
So
British.
where was
What
the
you're saying is
capitalist-
Hitler.
where
So what you're
was
saying is that what you're saying is that Hitler was based and he got betrayed by a bunch of like capitalists.
I'm saying he didn't. No, I'm saying because he didn't do the land reform early enough. If he did that, if he was doing land reform early enough, then maybe he would have stood a chance at all.
Look,
the
you
way that
said
he-
that in
like,
another
I'm
miss.
saying it
Like,
doesn't
who
fucking
are
matter.
the major capitalists supporting Hitler prior to his election?
Henry Ford. name
So
one, like,
what,
how many
what
do you want me to name?
what was the financial support
Well,
for
which
the Nazi
election?
Party
There
by
were
Henry
multiple
Ford?
elections. So which election are you referring to?
Okay, anytime prior to him taking power, what was the major
After
capitalist support?
32, he met with industrialists and they supported him in the next election.
There was no election after. What do you mean after 32?
There was an election in 32, I believe, and then
Oh,
after,
you mean in 32? Okay.
yeah.
All right, so this is from Henry Ashby Turner, who's a Yale historian who wrote like the most authoritative book on this. He says big business support was virtually zero prior to the election of 1933. It reached a high point in the spring of 32, followed by a decline through the autumn that continued until Hitler's appointment as chancellor. But at the high point in 1932, the NSDAP seemed unstoppable. So at that point, like the capitalists are trying to get on the winning team. But
It's not about whether or not they financially supported them, but I'm saying is that when he had to make up his,
they didn't support them at all. There's literally two major industrialists that
Here's the
supported
thing.
them prior
Here's
to
the
taking
thing. So
power.
prior to 32, I don't think that the majority of the ruling class in Germany was behind the Nazis and behind.
They were massively opposed to them.
Well, that's a debate.
One of the biggest capitalists in Germany supported the Sten's revolt, which was this SA revolt that was trying to take out Hitler.
Yeah, that's fine. But here's what's important. The Nazis would not have been able to seize and retain power if they did not act on behalf of the interests of the German ruling class. They did not come into power. My theory of
Why
Nazism
wasn't there
is...
support for them then?
What's that?
Why wasn't there support from them then, from the ruling class?
Well, because initially they were kind of like a street gang, right? But then they came to a point where they wanted to get elected and seize power, so they made a deal with the industrialists that, hey, we're going to be the kind of anarchist thugs
This is accurate.
that are going to keep things in line and keep things.
No, they vastly supported the
Hitler's speech
Republic
to-
still right up to
Hitler's-
1933.
in
In fact, the
32
Nazis actually took a more anti-capitalist line in 32.
But hold on, in
33,
32,
with the
Hitler gave a
Reichstag.
speech to the group of German industrialists saying, hey, we're the best bet to save you guys and allow you guys to keep your position. He almost...
Wait a second. I may be misremembering, and I may be misremembering the context, but just bookmark this because I'm going to look back at this later. I was under the impression that anti-socialism and whatnot, from Woods' perspective, was a juvenile thing that fascists engaged in as like a rhetorical trick. But now this is part of a substantive description of Nazi ideology.
said this stuff ad verbatim in 32.
Yeah, and in 1933, so Turner says, it championed the prerogatives of the parliament and the interests of workers as part of an offensive designed to discredit...
Okay, guys, no making fun of accents here unless he starts actually like deploying racial slurs. Then it's fair game. Just because there are people who have that accent, it's a lovely accent, who aren't like this.
Happens presidential, what they call cabinet of barons. The NSDAP swerved
They had
sharply
rhetoric.
leftward.
Yeah, they were rhetoric and words. And
Okay,
then-
but where's the material support?
Screw it. I've joked about it too. I made a video once where he was talking about, was it Heraclitus? He was like, all things are one, and this one is bean. I just put like pictures of beans everywhere. It's beautiful.
For the Nazis? I mean, you're saying like the kind of, you know, the kind
I
of...
don't
think you're
think they
understanding
had
my
any.
point.
I don't think they had necessarily substantive material support among the German people to actually seize power. They seized first. They were kind of an organization that was filled with many lumpen elements and declassed elements and middle class type of elements, and they were kind of a ragtag group of thugs, basically, right? And then they were, when the time came, they were allowed to have power by the German capitalists. So they never actually had a substantive base in the German people at all. It's just they were anarchists, more or less, who were allowed. They were unleashed on German society.
What does that mean that
German
they
ruling
never had
class.
substantive support? I mean, they won the election without support from major industrialists, with most industrialists supporting the Republic.
At what point did they win the election without the support of the industrialists?
1933.
No, by 33, they already had the industrialists behind them.
No, they didn't.
Yes, they
okay,
did.
who was supporting them?
All of them, all the major German
That's
industrialists.
not true. That's not true.
Yeah,
there was one industrialist that was openly pro-Nazi.
Openly, yeah, but I'm not talking about openly.
Okay, so how can you? Well, what are you going to do to prove it? Do you have any?
Yes, Hitler, I'm talking about.
Well, what you would do is you would look first of all at like the Nazi records of their own interactions with these industrialists, and you would look at the things that they did, whether or not they conduced to Nazi success or not. This isn't difficult.
Turner wrote a book on
let me
this,
try to look
and
it
he couldn't find he couldn't find one person except Fritz.
Hitler's
Thyssen
speech to industrialists.
Okay, so you're going to tell me his speech again? Where's the material support?
Okay, so if Hillary Clinton is giving speeches to major industrialists, do you think there's any material support there, or is that just a coincidence?
Then there was
This is silly. Every bit of support we're going to have for any of this is going to be textually based. Material. What does material support mean? It's going to mean a chain of text of documents that establish a relation.
There's also the secret meeting in 20th of February 1933. Hitler and 20 to 25 industrialists.
Has is much better than I've ever seen him, but it bothers me that the debates I've seen where he screamed like a child was with leftists, and here he's being all civil with fascists. I actually like that about him, and there's actually I think it's actually being responsible in this particular case. So again, he is very, in my experience, extremely hostile to like leftist lights or people who are banking on their political ideology as a selling point. Here he is actually debating very seriously with principal opponents. And I think that's the distinction, because he's not trying to make them look like fools to a mutual audience. He's actually trying to reason with their audience, which I think makes sense in this context. Like, to make a comparison, I think one of the ways in which Vosch's, especially his early performance, was very bad, is that he would attempt to do what Haas does to like fellow leftists, quote unquote, or to phony leftists, or whatever you want to say. Like, from his vantage, I'm not rendering that judgment myself in a general sense. He would attempt to play that game with his opponents, and the problem with that is that tells them and their audience, because they have a victim complex, right? It tells them that this person is afraid to actually deal with them fairly. He's dealing with them fairly, and he's actually doing very well. So.
He often reached out to try and get support from industrialists, but it never materialized into anything.
No, he received the
Okay,
equivalent.
So Keith Wood's argument seems to rely on just a poverty of like explicit contractual. Well, I mean, basically, the absence of text documents saying that, hey, this group of industrialists were explicitly and legally in league with the Nazis, or something like that. So it's actually quite weak.
He's like fully in, and he's like,
he
he's
received the
installed.
equivalent of around 10 million. What is today in today's terms? It was 2 million Reichsmarks at the time. Were contributed at the meeting, so he was
From
giving
who?
support.
From who?
Let me see. Let's go. This was all stuff from the
Like,
news.
Turner's emphatic on this, that like they raised a lot of money from small donations, and they were really good at collecting a lot of small
That was
donations.
before. That was before.
No, it's the same right up to then.
No, it was before 32.
Turner says only through gross distortion
Not that much. That's ridiculous.
can big business be afforded a crucial or even major role in the downfall of the republic. He's absolutely emphatic on this.
Yeah, but he couldn't possibly be talking about what everyone.
I mean, you're not
already
giving me anything. You're like, oh, they had a meeting here and there. I mean, yeah, the party like existed for one.
So I can actually show you.
Of course, we're gonna reach
So it had nothing to do with their millions
So-
of members.
so there's,
it was just like these like three capitalists that gave him a few
No,
mil on the
it's far
stud.
more. IG Farben, 400,000 Reichsmarks. You have a guy named Der A. Stenke, 200,000.
Keep in mind, like, at this point, a large appeal of the Nazi Party was the relative massive poverty of German workers after the as a result of reparations, and as a result of the blockade. So, like, we're talking about huge sums of cash here. Why are they arguing over who supported the Nazis? Well, because they've kind of drifted away from the actual essence of the debate, or what the debate was supposed to be concerned with, which is whether or not China is fascist. And it seems like what they're falling on here is Has and Logo have given, mostly Has to be fair, have given a fairly substantive definition of socialism that does actually structurally distinguish it from fascism, whereas Keith Woods and Joel Davis are relying upon, again, like pragmatic decisions made by fascist states that are very similar, or rather socialist states that are very similar to the activities of fascist states historically. you can make that case, and you can say that the attitudes towards politics are similar in some respects. But since that's going to be downstream from the state form, and since socialism directly reflects again an attitude towards the state form that treats it as a malleable structure from which it can evolve out of, or from which we can evolve out of, shall we say? Like we're talking about the fading of the state, right? They're talking past each other, but at the same time, I don't think even at a factual level, Joel and Keith are really there. I'm a little bit disappointed by Joel, actually. I was expecting him to be the more substantive of the two, but he's falling back on a very polemic approach that just, and again, like vis-a-vis Haas is looking like the most civil participant in this debate right now. I think they were anticipating a bloodbath, and he's giving it to them, but not in the way they were expecting.
You have Karl Hermann, 150,000. Automobile, Osterlag, Berlin, 100,000. Karl Hermann, Berlin, Deutsch, I can't pronounce this shit, 150,000. Pretty much a lot of people are giving them money here. You know, it's not just one or two people.
I know where you're getting.
It was more the Great Depression that did them in. Central bankers and policymakers managed to handle the impact of the Treaty of Versailles by the mid to late 20s. Okay, thank you for that. This isn't my area, but I do know that the numbers we're talking about, to attribute that to to attribute that to individual donations is ridiculous. Like televangelists don't make that much for the most part, relatively speaking.
This from because Turner says that there's only two major industrialists that supported the Nazis prior to their election, Sitzen and von Borsig. And Sitzen ended up in the
which election are you talking
publicly,
about?
Prior to him getting into power, any of the elections, prior to him getting into power.
It must have been before the election of 33. You're probably talking about before the election of 32.
No, he's talking about them before getting into power. Like I said, I can give you the quote again. Only through gross distortion can big business be afforded a crucial or even major role in the downfall of the republic.
So he's talking about before 32.
If Hawes had a deep British accent, he would sound way more convincing. Have you heard Hawes swear? He started like cussing in Arabic midway through his debate with Perspective Philosophy, and I had to mute him from it because I didn't know what the hell he was saying. It's demonic sounding. He has a scary voice when he wants to.
No, the downfall of the republic when Hitler gets into power. Quote,
well, okay, listen.
Consolidation of Hitler's regime
listen,
after
Turner,
he becomes chancellor.
I can't
He and his party had previously received relatively
how
little support from that quarter.
How does Turner address the Hitler's speech to the Industry Club in 1932? Like, how does he address these kind of things?
Yeah, Turner yeah, of course. Like Hitler was trying to reach out to influential people. You know, one of his friends went to America to meet Henry Ford, but he'd never commit anything financially. You know, they were in touch with like the white Russian emigres, and they tried to reach out to industrialists. Von Borsig, who was one of the two industrialists that supported him, tried to get before they got power. He tried to raise support in Berlin, and he was an anomaly. He gave up after a few months, and he doesn't seem to have supported them materially at all prior to getting into power.
But even if he got some cash on the side, you're telling me in like 1937 that if one of these industrialists pissed Hitler off, that he couldn't do something about it, like. The dude consolidated his power. Sometimes you gotta play a little chess. You know what I mean?
Well,
I don't really see a huge problem with it.
But they went leftward before getting into power.
I'm looking at a source right now. Hold on.
To like sort of, I don't feel like my point was addressed, so I'll kind of expand on it.
Okay, hold on. I can. The same official estimate to the total. Sorry, Lord, I don't mean to cut you off, man.
Yeah, just shut up, Logo. The grown-ups are talking. That poor man. Was it Turkish? I don't know. I don't know what Haz actually speaks. All I know is I couldn't understand it, and I didn't know what that meant in terms of TOS or what have you. And I'm a moderator. It's my job not to allow that kind of stuff. I remembered it though. Yeah. All right. How much is left? 125. Oh, god damn it. An hour left. Okay, let's keep going.
I just going through the source. Just go right after me, right? Total contributions for one of the Reichstag election campaigns of 32, and approximately 200,000 to 300,000 marks. Of this, he reported no more than, so 10 to 15% had gone to the Nazis, and this was in 32.
10 to 15%. Well, I gave you a quote that he very big support in 32, and then it declined shortly after, and they went leftward.
When did they go leftward?
In like the spring of 32, right up to getting elected.
Yeah, but this was in rhetoric. This wasn't actually what was going on behind the scenes.
What do you mean? What was happening behind the scenes? They got less support from big business before the 1933 election. I'll give you another quote from Turner. Quite contrary to the widespread impression that Hitler gained power in January 33 with strong backing from big business, his appointment to the chancellorship came just when relations between his movement and the business community had reached the lowest point since the NSDAP's election gains of 1930 had forced it upon the attention of the politically engaged men of big business.
Well, it's the lowest point, but relative to what? Because it's
so basically he played the game. He got in position, and then once he had a run at power, he just started giving the middle finger.
Okay. Well,
Logo,
let
Logo
didn't even get the material support to
I'm going to read more. Logo, go ahead.
Go ahead. Find the source. Good luck.
Go ahead.
So my point was that he, unlike the communists, right? The communists tended to depose the former order and replace it entirely with their own new order, right? So like this is why there was like tons of like purges and things, because you had a ton of like fucking intelligence agents and industrial assets and fucking capitalists all over the place from all over the world, really, in that country who were trying to get what they could out of this new developing country. In Germany, Hitler didn't do that. He didn't get rid of these people. He didn't replace.
He got rid of a lot of them. Yeah, if they violated the national interest, he got them. Fritz Thyssen was the biggest supporter of the Nazis prior to getting power. He led the biggest.
I didn't finish my point.
So Logo's critique of Hitler
nationalized his business in 1930.
The problem with Hitler is that he didn't kill enough people.
No, not enough of the capital.
Okay, I have a quote right here.
Anyone that opposed national interest.
I'm reading a source.
It's kind of true. Like Stalin was kind of way more badass in a way.
Stalin was way more badass.
Yeah,
this is page 68 of the book, Henry Turner, Big Business and the Rise of Hitler. He says, but more important, once he was in office, Hitler demonstrated that he was always reassured them, not a socialist. He therefore had no difficulty in extracting large sums from big business, starting with the campaign for the Reichstag election of March 1933. These contributions unquestionably aided Hitler significantly.
Boom. See, that's that's the trouble with quotes, is that if you haven't actually read the book for yourself, anybody else can dig it up really fast and contextualize them.
But they aided him in the consolidation of his power. And this is
I have a quote from Turner where he says big business support was virtually zero prior to the election.
Personally, I couldn't give a fuck. It's like if I was in Germany in 1933 and Hitler just became like Führer or whatever, I would have been.
Again, the reason why I'm saying watch their eyes is because when you are listening to one speaker, when Logos is listening, Logos does not have info being fed to him. Logos is a little bit clueless, and he's being a little bit timid, and I wish he wouldn't do that. Infrared is looking straight ahead, and when he's thinking, he looks down, or he looks up. He doesn't look at his screen. Joel and Keith, throughout this entire debate, are like this. And they're like this because there are people in their chat who are feeding them lines.
Like fucking swing
No,
is
I'm
better than the
quoting from
alternative.
my own source where he says that
Logo is sick, well then he's off the hook. It's also like bluntly, I think Logo is just not the kind of person for this kind of debate. But and has lied here, as that quote is nowhere within the book. Why don't we look at that ourselves? I'm a little bit curious now. That would be interesting. Let's find this out for ourselves. Okay. Good old LibGen. Turner, Big Business, Hitler. Okay. This is now a theory stream. Hitler relied heavily on the military and former aristocracy for financing and prestige. Given how tied aristocracy is to industry, you could just go that route and undercut the Nazi. Yeah. Yeah, you could. Alright, let's open this guy up. Sorry, because I'm streaming, it's obviously like slower, so I'm just waiting for this book to download, and then we'll open it up and find it ourselves. However, grain of salt, we're going to be reading this without a lot of context, because I don't have time to read like a large chunk of this book on stream, but we'll try and find the section that Haas is looking at. So we'll rewind, we'll get his quote, we'll find it, and we'll contextualize it. Oh, come on. Stop being so slow. Oh, wait. Wait, we're almost there. We're almost there. It's downloading. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. It's so close. Oh, maybe I can find a PDF. Or not a PDF, maybe I can find Turner Big Business. Nazis, full text. Or maybe we can quickly find what the thesis was. Let's look it up on Wikipedia. Maybe that'll help. Just while we're waiting for the actual thing to download. I might not be able to do it. Just because OBS is, of course, hogging the bandwidth, so. Okay, scholarship. And there's no link. There's, oh, God damn it. There's no. Oh wait, manuscripts and archives. Maybe. Alas. Well, we have a few seconds to chat. It's only looking like there's 20% of the download left. So, actually, if anybody in chat wants to do me a huge favor, rewind yourself, find me the exact quotes that were used by Haas and by Keith, and we'll locate those in their context. Does that make sense? What do I think of the term red fascist? I don't particularly like it. Again, because I think a socialist and a fascist have fundamentally different... oh, here we go. It opened. Have fundamentally different conceptions of political forms and what's appropriate. Okay, so here we go. We have notes. We're going to open up that. And, whoa, boom. That's too big. Let's center that a little bit. Okay. And we'll put me over top of it. There we go. And we'll shrink me down a tiny bit. Okay. All right, so let's find the quotes, okay? So we're going to... We're going to open up this first of all. And we're going to find the exact quote. We're going to go back 2 minutes, I think.
Something about it, like, you know, like the dude consolidated his power. Sometimes you gotta play a little chess. You know what I mean?
So
Like,
I'm
I don't
looking
really
at
see a
a
huge problem
source
with
right
it.
now.
Okay, here we go.
They went leftward before getting into power.
I'm looking at a source right now. Hold on.
Okay.
Yeah, good
To
luck.
like sort of, I don't feel like my point was addressed, so I'll kind of expand on
Okay,
it.
hold on. I
My
can.
point was,
Okay.
right,
Yeah, shut up, logos. Here we go.
The same
They did-
official
okay, you got it.
estimate
Yeah, okay.
to the total. Sorry, Logo. I don't mean to cut you off, man. This is I've just been looking through the source. Just go right after me, right? Total contributions for one of the Reichstag election campaigns of 32, and approximately 200,000 to 300,000 marks of this.
Okay, let's take that number. Search. Where do we search here? Tools. Oh, this is weird. Did they update? What is going on? Oh, I see. Okay. So can we find? Here we go. There we go. Okay, so 30,000.
This you reported no more than okay, so 10 to 15% had gone to the Nazis, and this was in 32.
10 to 15% of what?
Total contributions for one of the Reichstag election campaigns of 32.
We'll look up that. Total contributions. Total contributions of one of the... Is Reichstag 1G or 2G? No dice. Okay, total contributions of one of the. Nope. Total contributions. Oh, god damn it. Sorry about this. This is a bit impromptu. Oh, you can't find the phrase total contributions either? Well, this isn't looking very good.
And approximately 200,000 to 300,000 marks. Of this, he reported no more than...
Okay, of this he reported no more than. I'm assuming that this is a quote, by the way. He could be paraphrasing. Oh, shoot, what was the actual wording? Hang on. God damn it.
Total contributions for one of the Reichstag election campaigns of 32, and approximately 200,000 to 300,000 marks. Of this, he reported no more than... okay, so 10 to 15% had gone to the Nazis, and this was in...
Okay, 10 to 15%. Let's look up 15%. Nope. Let's look up 15%. Okay, let's read this section that it brought us to initially, because maybe that'll help us. In the late 1920s, Farben's supervisory board included 3 Reichstag deputies, one of the firm's directors. Here, oh, I think this might be actually. Acting with far-reaching discretionary powers, it bestowed each year a total of about 300,000 marks in the DDP, the Center, and the DVP. These were considerable sums at a time when the annual budget of the national headquarters of a major party, such as the DNVP, came to only about 500,000 marks, and when a bourgeois party could mount an election campaign in some of the 35 electoral districts of the Republic for as little as 20,000 to 30,000 marks. Farben by no means stood alone in contributing to more than one party. Few big businessmen felt a strong loyalty to any one of the Weimar parties, with the possible exception of some devout Catholics who clung to the Center Party on grounds of religious identification. I see. Despite the often formidable financial resources the capitalists and their agents could bring to bear, the politicians showed themselves disconcertingly resistant to manipulation through material rewards and punishments. Can somebody, like, get me the actual quote? It's the bit about the consolidation of power that Keith is talking about, not... Oh, I see. Haas's quote is page 68. Oh, bless you. It's like... What the hell? Okay, well, we're close enough. We'll just go from here. Okay, here we go. Okay. Although a radical tone prevailed in the NSDAP's Reichstag delegation on economic issues, the Nazi left wing did not gain official endorsement for its brand of National Socialism. Its chief spokesman, Gregor Strasser, made such an attempt in early 1926. Hitler made clear to a meeting of party officials at Bamberg in February 1926 his unwillingness to consider any revision of the party program. Hitler did not throttle the left-wing elements altogether, even after the party began toward the end of the decade to broaden its appeals to encompass economically conservative farmers and middle-class voters. The left-wing continued to compete vigorously with the leftist parties for workers' support. Hitler even acquiesced when left-wing organizers circumvented his ban on Nazi trade unions by founding party factory cells. By the fall of 1926, the factory cell movement had grown into a full-fledged organ of the party, the National Socialist Factory Cell Organization, and had won Hitler's recognition. Hitler also raised no objections to the anti-capitalist rhetoric that pervaded a number of widely circulated quasi-official periodicals. I'm not seeing the quote here. What are we looking at here? Sorry, are we looking for... What version are we looking for page 68? Try searching the to see if it works. Actually, you'd think I wouldn't be able to word search, but the first time I did word search, it actually worked. So some of these are identifiable. But yeah, I understand that generally. That's not how that works. I just want to know, like, let's see. He said 300,000, right? So when we looked up 300,000, see that right there? Oh, you can't see it. It's over my head. Let me move that. Oh no, you can't see it. So look, right next to my head down here, it actually found the word. So Adobe can find this. Okay. Yeah, this is too dense. I can't verify this quickly. But I think this is the quote though. So money may also have gone to the NSDAP from the Central Political Fund of IG Farben in the spring or early summer of 1932. Gatineau mentioned at that time to Ilgner, having learned that for the first time the Nazis had been included in the contributions distributed to political parties by the Cali Circle or the Kranzgen, the political committee of senior Farben executives headed by Wilhelm Cali of Farben's board of directors. According to Ilgner's recollection after the war, Gatineau told him that the NSDAP had received 10 to 15% of the total of 200 to 300,000 marks paid out by the Kranzgen. At Nuremberg, Gatineau repeated the same story, setting the allocation for the Nazis at 10%. There are grounds, however, to question the reliability of his version. It remains unclear, most basically, how a junior official charged with public relations could have become privy to such information. As the testimony of numerous Farben executives at Nuremberg unanimously attests, the Kranzgen operated behind a heavy veil of secrecy that excluded even those senior executives not in Cali's circle. What is the Kranzgen? I don't know what this is. Let's wonder if it'll actually copy that. Oh my god. Okay. Anyways, we can't do this here. This isn't going to work. But we'll I'll look that over because I am curious. We'll close that up. Just gonna Google Kranzgen quickly so I know what we're talking about here. Does anybody know what Kranzgen is? Anyone? I don't know. I'll look it over later so I'll know, but it is what it is.
32.
10 to 50% of what? Well, I gave you the quote that they raised big support in 32, and then it declined shortly after, and they went leftward.
When did they go leftward?
Yeah, they didn't go leftward. It seems from my reading that Hitler had basically just for political reasons given free rein to socialists within his party in order to, again, like accrue support from the middle and lower classes. Okay.
In like the spring of 32, right up to getting elected.
Yeah, but this was in rhetoric. This wasn't actually what was going on behind the scenes.
What do you mean? What was happening behind the scenes? They got less support from big business before the 1933 election. I'll give you another quote from Turner. Quite contrary to the widespread...
Sorry, so Samuel Crow asks, would you mind elaborating a bit on the difference between National Socialism and fascism? You mentioned that the Nazis weren't fascists, but that seems wrong. The critical difference is that the Nazi Party was explicitly racist in its structure, whereas the fascists were statist. So one is fronting the community as an ethical body, where one is characterizing the state as a racial body.
Impression that Hitler gained power in January 33 with strong backing from big business. His appointment to the chancellorship came just when relations between his movement and the
Kranzgen means a circle of people who meet regularly? Okay, so I got nothing then.
Business community had reached the lowest point since the NSDAP's election gains of 1930 had forced it upon the attention of the politically engaged men of big business.
Well, it's the lowest point, but relative to what? Because it's
so basically he played the game. He got in position, and then once he had a run at power, he just started giving the middle finger.
Okay. Well,
Logo, why don't you go in?
Yeah, let
Logo
Logo
get the material support to
I'm going to read more. Logo, you go ahead.
Go ahead.
Find the source. Good luck.
Go ahead.
So my point was that he, unlike the communists, right? The communists tended to depose the former order and replace it entirely with their own new order, right? So like this is why there was like tons of like purges and things, because you had a ton of like fucking intelligence agents and industrial assets and fucking capitalists all over the place from all over the world, really, in that country, who were trying to, you know, get what they could out of this new developing country. In Germany, Hitler didn't do that. He didn't get rid of these people. He didn't replace.
He got rid of a
them.
lot of them. Yeah, if they violated the national interest, he got rid of them. Fritz Thyssen was the biggest supporter of the Nazis prior to them getting power. He led the biggest steel
I didn't
company.
finish my point.
So Logan's critique of Hitler is
nationalized his business in 1930.
the problem with Hitler is that he
Hitler was a
didn't
loser.
kill enough people. You know,
Not enough of the capital.
Okay, I have a quote right here.
Anyone that
didn't
opposed
replace the
national
ancient
interest, he got rid of. He
Okay,
threw them
I'm
in
reading
concentration
a source.
It's kind of true. Like Stalin was kind of way more badass in a way.
Stalin was way more badass.
Yeah,
This is page 68 of the book, Henry Turner, Big Business and the Rise of Hitler. He says, but more important, once he was in office, Hitler demonstrated that he was always reassured them, not a socialist. He therefore had no difficulty in extracting large sums from big business, starting with the campaign for the Reichstag election of March 1933. These contributions unquestionably aided Hitler significantly. But they aided him in the consolidation of his power. And this is Turner.
I have a quote from Turner where he says big business support was virtually zero prior to the election.
Personally, I couldn't give a fuck. It's like if I was in Germany in 1933 and Hitler just became like Führer or whatever, I would have been like fucking sweet.
No, I'm quoting from my own source where he says that was virtually zero support prior to the election of 1933.
But he says big business contributed significantly to the consolidation of Hitler's power in 1933.
Well, if he says that, that contradicts the entire rest of the book.
Well, he says
it's virtually zero prior to the election. Why can't you name some?
He said they aided him in the consolidation of his power, not its acquisition. So he's not saying that.
Okay, so when he comes to power, then they get on board. Yeah, of course. They didn't put him in power, though.
But to consolidate his power is the point.
Yeah, so he gets into power, and they're like, okay, we better support.
But you have to understand that Turner, which is
you gotta pay the man. He's fucking running the show.
He's one of the historians, and there's other historians who disagree with him. He's one of the historians who are trying to come from the angle that big business was not responsible for the Nazis. That's his thesis. That's what he's working with. And even if we agree with that,
so your argument is just
what you said about big business not supporting him in the elections is just wrong.
No, what you said doesn't contradict it. It said that he had no support prior to the election, and then they helped him consolidate power. That's support after he got elected.
I agree.
I kind of want to move this topic.
Listen, I agree. They didn't have major support before the election in 32, but by 33, he had the support.
Do you want me to quote again? Big business support was virtually zero prior to the election of 1933. That's from Turner in his conclusion.
Just ligma.
But after 1933, it changes.
When he's in power, the capitalists, when he's in power, they're like, shit, Hitler's in power, we better not.
They were instrumental in consolidating that power, is the point.
Was the question concerning ultimately how he came to power, or what was the from where his power was derived, right? Because these are distinct. Because I think we're kind of waffling between whether we're talking about whether or not there was corporate power behind Hitler's rise to power, or behind Hitler's power after in power. Where his power was derived. So we're talking about. I'm taking your faith from that, Einzelganger, that is indeed the case. Well, we'll just address both. So if indeed the question is long lost, from where Hitler's power was derived simpliciter, not originally, but just in general, well, we would treat him then as when he is in power, of course. And where does his power flow from? Well, this appears to be a concession on the part of Keith Woods and Joel Davis, that indeed it was derived from corporate wealth. However, if the question was by whose power did the Nazi Party come into office, then I don't know. But like we're running through books quickly on stream, so it's like.
All right, now.
because they didn't want to get thrown in a concentration camp like he did to Thidson.
By the way, we're gonna take some.
No, because his power was not consolidated by then. He wasn't even consolidated at that point. That's what you're not understanding here. They didn't have to help him
Well,
consolidate.
like this
his
just
power.
blows out the theory.
He had a lot of dudes ready to throw people in jail and shoot
they
people.
could have worked to get rid of Hitler. And by the way, I'm just going off of your source. I'm not even going from sources that.
Okay, well, if you want to accept that source, you'll have to accept his conclusion that big business had
I'm just
virtually
saying
no
it
role in
contradicts
the
what
Nazis
you're
coming
saying.
to power.
No, that's not inherently true. No, I haven't again reviewed the source, so I can't really comment on that. But a source can cite factual material accurately and then draw faulty conclusions from the material it has. Like we do this in philosophy all the time, where people will argue against interpretations of, extrapolations from previous arguments incorrectly, and then people review that and say, hey, this is actually kind of flawed. They do a good job here, but then they go way off the deep end in their conclusions, stuff like that.
That's what I'm contesting. I'm not contesting that they supported him when they came to power. I'm saying the communist idea that this was somehow
He did not fully
capitalist
have
This
reaction
is so
to bringing
much
him to
more
power is
boring.
nonsense.
Listen,
He
man,
did not
here's a
have
really
full power
interesting
by
point.
then.
Do you want to hear an interesting point? Okay, this is like this argument
I
over
doubt
like,
this
did they
would be
fund them at
interesting,
this
by the way.
point? Does this matter? Okay, all right. Do you know how? Okay, so all of
That's
the German
material
intelligence
historical
staff.
reality.
Yes, this is material historical. Intelligence agencies are the most important thing for a country. Okay, so how
Are you
why
going to
did
do like
all of-
the Anglo intelligence was secretly pulling the strings of everything?
It wasn't secret. That's where the term double agent comes from. Literally, why do you think that the British had all of Nazi communications throughout the entirety of the war decrypted the entire time?
So if
There
they
was
were
nothing
controlling
they didn't
Germany,
know.
why did Germany go to war with Britain and start like bombing British cities?
The British actually fucked up super hard when they were trying to bomb London because the British had so infiltrated German intelligence that they fed them wrong answer. Like they told them that their missiles were landing in the wrong place. They had all of their sources telling them this. So they actually directed the V2 rockets to miss London from London the entire
Okay,
fucking
yeah,
time.
yeah, I know, yeah, they had like good intelligence on Germany.
This is news to me. Now, somebody here says that only 50 out of 12,000 of the Abwehr were double agents. Maybe. I don't think that's necessarily a contradiction, though. I don't actually know off the top of my head how many, or even if many even make sense. It would probably have more to do with what kinds of influence those plants had, right? Britain did not have German communications decrypted the entire time. Yeah, that was my understanding too. That was the whole idea behind like the Turing thing, right? Because they had to decrypt it. So Haz was right on the point. This is done behind the curtains. To say Nazism's aim was to extract surplus along racial lines shows a fundamental misunderstanding of National Socialism. I don't know who that's responding to. If somebody can provide any clarity on the point vis-a-vis the Turner book, that would be extremely helpful. I haven't read the Turner book, so I can't judge this.
So how did that? Why did that? Why was that possible to happen in this state? Like, why were the people, the intelligence agents, not loyal to Hitler?
What is this supposed to
Hold
be?
on, I have a question for Keith. So, in the spring of 1932, Krupp and IG Farben bailed the Nazi Party out of bankruptcy. Is this true or no?
That's the first I've heard of it. I didn't encounter
Well,
it in the
your
Turner book.
source said that in the spring of 1932, that industrial support or the support by big businesses was at a high, and then later in 32 it went down. So it would be consistent with what you quoted from your own source.
G. Farben says
Yeah,
pretty
but he
based on
also says only through gross distortion can big business be afforded a major role in the downfall.
Because
of the
that's
Republic.
his narrative. That's his specific narrative as a historian. He's not the only historian. It's not the only narrative. So let's just
Also,
stick
like
to the
that
facts.
one.
This is an apropos point. Now, what strikes me as a little bit strange here is that Keith Woods is intimately familiar with the conclusions of this book, but not with the line directly preceding the quote that he cited. Again, I can't judge the veracity of this, but that strikes me as immediately suspect. If you are deploying an argument from a particular part of a text and you are unfamiliar, especially with the stuff preceding it or with the stuff immediately after it, that tells me that you've been fed the quote and you haven't actually read it. It's sort of like when the academic agent says that he's read all 3 volumes of Capital, but he can't identify what C, V, and S stand for when called upon to address like a fundamental part of Marx's formulation. And furthermore, he can't even give a wrong answer because he has no recollection of encountering it because he hasn't actually read the book.
Well,
like,
there's another one. There's another book called Who Financed Hitler that has the same conclusion.
Yeah, and to be clear, like Turner's, I briefly like Wikipedia'd the Turner book, and it doesn't appear to be controversial among historians. So we're talking about two readings. And to be clear as well, I don't think Hawes read the book either. We're all just like slapdash searching for quotes at this stage, which is silly. They needed to have like the quotes available with context and explaining why they're ironclad related to the arguments they're presenting.
Okay, there's a lot of
Mao
books about a lot
Zedong's
of
dick
things.
was probably like
But
4 inches
see,
max.
you have to understand that ideologically speaking, it is in your interest to find sources that support your ideological position. So these are
But
not
that's
only...
like the authoritative book on this. He's like one of the most respected historians of the 20th century. I can give you Who Financed Hitler by Suzanne
Listen,
Poole either.
My question is, what is the fucking point of defending these loser regimes that fucking failed when there's actually like winning regimes that you see like some elements of things that you would want in? For
Yeah,
instance, like
China is
China.
winning because it's a fascist regime.
That's fascists lose. Fascists always lose. So how the fuck are they fascist? Or unless you're saying that they're going to lose because Joe Biden's calling them fascist.
Now, what is that?
You
Wait,
agree
wait.
with our national security chief. Why? What's the point of that? Like, what are you accomplishing by defending fascism? What is the point?
This is a bad argument. And it can be deployed in both ways is the problem, right? Because then they can say, well, the Soviet Union collapsed. Look at all these socialist societies that have failed to actualize socialism as we're going to characterize it. Like it's just this isn't a good tack to take by Logo. I'm very disappointed in his performance here.
Like they lost. It failed. It's not a project.
Listen, this is before
the accomplishment is just like that. This distinction is pretty murky. Like it's not like as it's not a very hard and fast distinction. When you look at historical contingency, you can explain the differences between these regimes rather than looking at it through the lens of ideology.
So
and the lens of ideology, it's
why
retarded.
did the German intelligence? Why did the German intelligence services collaborate with the British?
Is there like some kind of big structural reason for that? I mean, that seems like some kind of contingent historical kind of
No,
BS.
but why did they do it? It's just contingent. I mean, that didn't happen in other cases. I mean, it didn't happen the other way around. The German intelligence. No, I'm asking you, what is your explanation for that?
I'm not really aware of like major collaboration between the intelligence
you aren't?
services.
Well, maybe you should read about the British intelligence services at the time because it's actually extremely important.
Yeah, I know they were tracking a lot of German communicators and like they made great advances in like intercepting German communication. But
no, they flipped. They had great advances in human intelligence.
Okay, so if England was directing Germany, why did Germany go to war with Britain in a war that bankrupted Britain and like ended the British Empire?
I mean, that's a really long, complicated question. We can talk about it in stages. Because
I'm sure you got a super big brain answer that would take forever to explain.
I mean, you should listen to some of the stuff we put out on the Sudcast because we go really deep into this shit because it's fucking really complicated. Like,
I don't know, man.
It's not that simple.
I'm too transphobic for the Sudcast, unfortunately.
Whatever, guys. But I'm saying you actually can't explain your hermeneutic of this. Can't explain why the British intelligence agencies were able.
This has nothing to do with the question of the debate. I think he just wants to be involved at this point, and he would have been better just to keep stroking his beard. So they got by the Turner source. Add some ambiguity here. So, oh god, look at Joel's nose. Looks like it's like stretching out. So the Turner text. Okay, so the question was whether or not fascist power was derived from corporate wealth or corporate whatever. There was a link there, and I if I recall, I think the point was that there's a similarity with China because China allows for private investing. Among like wealthy party members, and the argument was that this is actually done by the state as opposed to done by private corporations, so there's a fundamental structural distinction. And now we move over to okay, but that wouldn't help them, so why are they bringing that? Right, so they were saying that the Nazis didn't have corporate involvement, and I can't recall if they were saying that was better or if that made it akin to what China was doing. This is such a mess. To be honest, these debaters simply don't know enough about Chinese political economy, except what they learn through an article here or there. It is amply clear from the points they're making. I mean, neither do I. Fascism only lost because the international financial elite lost their shit and sent half the world's army to stop it. I think that's questionable. Logos needs to stop. This is embarrassing.
To flip all of these people in the German intelligence agencies. And the reason why is because a lot of the people in the German intelligence agencies came from that landed class, that landed like old regime class. And a lot of them had really great relations because, again, like the hereditary aristocracy is not a national phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. All of these people,
I think we're pretty fine with it. I mean, at least I am fine with acknowledging that Hitler was not like the greatest statesman of all time. He was no Caesar. He was no Stalin. You know what I mean?
You can put that lightly.
Yeah. He was like
sucked.
Yeah. He wasn't. He was a he was a good public speaker or whatever. He was a charismatic individual, but he wasn't like a strategic genius like some of these other figures.
It was really like, pretty much all fascists were really shitty at actually governing states. They all failed.
I think Hitler and Mussolini, like, kind of like there's some decent evidence, definitely with Mussolini, and some evidence with Hitler. They kind of started out as feds, and then they just like their psyop just was too successful, and then they were like, sweet, like let's just keep doing this, and like.
Yeah, and because their power never came from the people, they were immediately taken out by the people who put them into power in the first place. So that's why
immediately. Well, there was that war in between that cost like millions of lives. I mean, the British Empire. But,
what that was an opportunity to redevelop.
That did not destroy the British Empire.
I mean, the British Empire was bankrupt by the war.
Yeah, but what destroyed the British Empire specifically was the triumph of the Soviet Union and the ability for the Soviet Union to help.
Yeah, which is the result of the war.
Yeah,
supposedly they were directed. So they directed this whole thing to end up in a way that was destroyed the British Empire.
You have to understand, if you have a dialectic perspective, these are the ironies of history. That you can.
I mean, that actually itself isn't inconsistent. Like, for example, Iran as an antagonistic state to America was a product of precisely that same kind of intervention. And there are myriad examples of this elsewhere. France and America and Vietnam, like, just, oh god. I'm starting to feel the fatigue hit me. This is painful.
You can act on behalf of your own interests, and this can at the same time be the source of your very own demise of these same interests.
It's almost like when American fascists like go out to have like a rally in their own interest, and then what it does is it's like the worst scandal for them of all time. Like in recent years, it's totally destroyed their
your argument is like Britain directed the whole thing because there were a lot of spies that were like turncoats, and they orchestrated like the entirety of the war. And for Germany to go to war with Britain and like take loads of British lives and bankrupt the British Empire, and have the Soviet Union wins, then that would destroy the British Empire. So
a few things about the Soviet Union throughout the course of the war. So by the time that it became clear, so the real position of the Allies when Germany invaded the Soviet Union was, let's just have hands off and see what's going to happen, because they were really betting that maybe Germany is going to eliminate the Soviet Union. They were completely fine with that. Now, when the Soviets proved that by their own initiative,
they were still at war with Germany.
Yeah, but at the same time, they were conducting secret negotiations with the Germans about coming to truce.
No, they turned down like 10 peace offers from Hitler.
But they were still negotiating
actually that was a British
with the Nazis in secret.
They actually had
they were refusing to open up a second
that
front,
would be possible
consistently. And then, curiously, immediately in the aftermath of the war, you have the development of Operation Unthinkable, which was a plan that by 1956 or 57, I forget which date, they were actually going to engage in a preemptive nuclear strike, killing 80 million civilians in the Soviet Union, effectively accomplishing.
Yeah, Churchill wanted to drop nukes on Soviet Union right after the Second World War.
Yeah, so did Bertrand Russell.
Yeah, the Soviets wanted to nuke China, and Nixon said no. So
I think it's like you have to be very careful about this idea that just because they are the allies, that means that they are serving each other's interests. Because for example,
I don't believe that. I mean, of course, Britain and America and the Soviet Union. Yeah, it's not like
it's like ISIS, right? Russia and America are both fighting. Although we know America funds them behind the scenes, but they're both fighting ISIS. But
I'm not disagreeing with this. I'm just like
it's a game moment.
The idea that Britain was like pulling the strings to destroy its empire for some greater. This is like
no. America was the listen. Okay, so America and Britain were competing. The real war in World War II is between America and Britain. Frankly, it's like it sounds really counterintuitive. But when you get down to it, that's really what it was all about. Because they like the other countries didn't have a fucking chance, man. Like it's not even close.
I don't know, man. I mean, the Germans are like 20 miles outside Moscow.
That makes sense. I'll explain how this can be understood. instead of thinking Britain as a monolith of an interest, you have to understand there's a struggle going on within Britain, which is between the kind of old ancien regime, the monarchy, and these kind of people, this old money kind of classes. And then you have, I guess, this new kind of national petty bourgeoisie and this new bourgeoisie within Britain. And the latter one, I think, is more aligned with America. The former one is secretly somehow connected to the Nazis. I don't know all the details of it, but there are really weird things. Like, for
The royal
example,
family,
have
there's
you seen the footage of the British royal family, the kids? They're doing the Hitler salute in the 30s, the middle of the 30s. It's
They're
like
all
they're
the
a weird
Why did they turn
connection.
down like multiple peace offers from Germany where they were going to like take their armies out of
Because those peace, that the idea of an Anglo-German peace, as I said, was a specific plot of the British intelligence agencies because they wanted Hitler to not put as much effort into that side of the front, believing that there would be a possible offer.
Why did they turn
and
them
that's
all
when
down?
that's when they invaded. They
Well,
turned them
the
down because
issue
they
is
set
that
them up.
Germany's credibility, as far as honoring treaties and peace treaties is concerned, was thrown out the window in several instances. So they already appeased Hitler, by giving him Czechoslovakia. He went back on his treaties with them when he invaded.
Yeah, but
Poland.
you've already said that
And
Hitler
then-
was like no threat to Britain. Like, if
and
there
then,
wasn't in their national
yeah.
interest to like destroy their empire over.
No,
like,
they
the
wanted
border dispute with
they wanted to
Poland.
reconstruct the global economy, right?
Yeah,
That's
there
what they
is
wanted
really
to
a
do.
contradiction here. The British Empire, by this time, is on its way out because of America. So you have reactionary classes within Britain who represent the reaction of the British Empire against this new development.
No,
And
they could
it
have
seems that
maintained
we
the
can draw
empire
a
longer without
connection
the Second
between
World
them
War.
and the Nazis.
They could have maintained it longer without the Second World War. It bankrupted them. I mean,
didn't-
Roosevelt
the thing is,
was sending a
was
ship to take the last.
they
of the
wanted
British
to
What I'm
troops
trying to
in
say
South
is that
Africa.
it was not in the interests of all of Britain that to be this force of reaction in the face of this dissolving empire, this empire that is clearly on its way out, on the decline. This new U.S.-led world order, which was based on, formally speaking, we know that's not the reality, kind of like national self-determination and sovereignty and the League of Nations and things like that. This was upsetting the former European colonial order. After World War I, the whole order was pretty much threatened. That's why, for example, the American response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia was so one of such like.
What does this have to do with the question of the debate? What is none of this bears on whether China is fascist. None of it. This has no relevance. And then for a brief second, Logo was like, he almost made a good point. He's like, guys, why do you care? And then he went on to something about the British intelligence. If you want to debate on whether China is fascist, you'll be sorely disappointed. Yeah, you're about 3 hours too late on that one, unfortunately. But thank you. Does anybody mind if we just jump ahead? I just want to see, like, what this turns into. Like, what happens if we jump to, like... Oh, let's look at the, let's look at the comments. Let's just try jumping ahead. Let's see what happens. Let's jump ahead to, like, 2 hours.
And alienation or whatever is a result of liberalism, because liberalism does not
No, the
acknowledge.
fact that
liberalism
they're
can
there
limit-
is the result of liberalism. The fact that they're there in the first place is
No,
the result of this is just
be that as it
neocolonialism.
may,
And you're like,
that it's a
you're
result
just
of liberal
scared to
policy.
assert like ethnic nationalism, so you're just like trying to get
No,
around
no,
it.
no,
this
it's
is
not
what I'm
about
trying to say. This is what I'm trying to say. At that point, you are not you don't actually care about the essence or the content of what Irish people really are, because that content, as far as form is concerned, is undecided. Maybe through the development of this content, the form can change, right? But if you elevate
Yeah, or
the
maybe it'll be
form
like the
to an
slide
idol,
room and like having these
if you
incompatible
elevate the
peoples that
form,
have to adopt
if
this
you
like
elevate
plastic
the form
culture
to
to make
an
it work
idol,
without violence.
you are just creating a mythology of the abstract Cartesian subject, of the liberal subject. You are betraying the.
Man, you're going to like
the name of the
extreme
form.
lengths to say that like people can't like choose to live together without like millions of migrants like coming.
Listen, here's the thing. This issue of immigration, again, I said the same thing. In liberalism, no differences are acknowledged. So there's a clear confusion that I'm used to a certain culture, I'm used to certain ways of living, and now I'm confronted with other people who have a very different way of living.
Okay, but do
This
groups
creates
have a right
confusion.
to a living space? Like, do groups have a right to self-segregate?
Groups, what do you mean? Countries have a right to self-determination?
Groups, like ethnic groups. You know, like if the Irish want to live amongst Irish people and not encounter.
No, because ethnic groups aren't rights-bearing entities. Ethnic groups aren't agents. They don't have minds. They don't have wants. It's just a description of either you're belonging to some category of somebody by inclusion via religion or via race, via like all sorts of different things, assuming you accept those categories as given. To say that they have a right to deliberately do a thing is absurd, because an ethnicity can't deliberately do a thing. It's not a conscious entity. A state can. A state has a deliberative process built into it. A country, insofar as we're equivocating between country and state, can. A city can. A polis can. Ethnicity, no. No. Because who is actually doing the segregating is not going to be an actual representative of the ethnicity. It'll be an agent who happens, perhaps, to bear the distinguishing marks of an ethnicity, whatever those are. But this doesn't make sense.
Counter these people for whatever great reasons you're saying. I mean, like, are you okay with that?
To be fair, all the Irish immigrants, all our countries are
I am not okay with creating a supranational body that's going to.
He doesn't mean by a right. It doesn't even matter if he means by a right. They can't even. They don't have the capacity to do it, because ethnicities, again, they can't self-segregate. They have to be segregated by some other body that is distinct from the ethnicity, because the ethnicity has no deliberative aspect to it. It can't make choices. It's just a category. Does that make sense? Like, you can't, like for example, if Keith were to ask, can white people choose to live only with white people? Individuals can. But if he says, can the white race decide to self-segregate? No. The white race can't decide, period. It doesn't have a decision-making faculty. Like a state could. Even an ethno-state could. Why? Because it's still a state. The ethno part is just the state has a policy towards only recognizing people, or rather, recognizing people according to racial characteristics or ethnic characteristics, whatever that is taken to mean. But it's able to make decisions because it is a state. A race can't make decisions. A religion can't make decisions. An ethnicity can't make decisions.
Force certain policies on a certain country. So if a country pursues this path of development that it wants to be isolationist, like, what do you want me to say? Do you think I think America?
He means as a state, not just random people? Well, no, because he's talking about a subset of people within a state already, right? The point is that segregation involves the authority of a state, ethnic groups, and yeah, that's my point. Yeah, by the way, like, a race not only lacks a deliberative element in that it can like do things in the world, it even lacks the ability to distinguish itself consciously from other races. That is going to be a relational thing that emerges from these concepts of like race and identity and things that are already ubiquitous in culture, right? Like, who even is a member of, like, letting aside the fact that it has no deliberative capacity, who even is considered to be a part of that deliberative apparatus, if indeed a race had one? Who is considered white is radically different depending on who you talk to. Everyone knows who is white and who is not. That's not true. That's not true at all. Here's a question. Are Persians white? Are Jews white? Are certain kinds of Spaniards white? Are the Irish white? That's an interesting question. Like, there's a whole... It's very complicated. It's not based on, oh, that person's got relatively pale skin. There are Europeans who have darker skin than people in China and Japan. There's no contradiction, or people, even some people in Arabic countries or in Iran. That's why when people talk about like demolishing whiteness, they aren't talking about getting rid of white people. They're talking about sort of dethroning the concept from its status of being widely held to be legitimate, because it's not. It doesn't describe anything in an apt way. It just sort of reifies distinctions that have already become ubiquitous through a series of historical accidents, ultimately. Look up the phrase Black Irish. Like,
should intervene and attack them? No, of course not. But
So
I can
racism
still
is
from
cool.
a distance. I can still from a distance, not forcing my view on them, say that I disagree with this path. I think
That's the beauty of self-determination, is they don't give a fuck what you think, because it's not you, it's not your country. It's not you.
Okay, so in Ireland, what do you think if you were to run like a plebiscite right now regarding immigration? How would that go? Do you think that the majority of Irish people actually agree with you?
Well, the last time we had a vote on birthright citizenship, it was the most popular referendum ever. It was like 92% voted against birthright citizenship. And anytime there's polls taken on attitudes to immigration in Europe, it's massively against the policy. There's always a majority.
But I don't think European, but here's what my analysis. I don't think European people do this because they have some notion of ethnic purity. I just think they're shocked and confused because of this encounter with people who have a
but that's natural. Why do you want to like just
you have a bunch of
let's find
US State
some way to
Department
get these
because
ABS doing psyops into their brains like 24/7.
The reason is because they live under a liberal system that does not afford them.
No, it's not. Like if a Somali, like if a group of Somalis live next to a group of Finnish people, like they're okay. Like it's not because of liberalism that there's like incompatibility.
Yeah,
like,
because in liberalism we are not allowed to acknowledge that we are different.
That's not it.
So like,
that is precisely it.
we're not allowed to acknowledge we're different, but then what's the implication of that acknowledgement? The implication is maybe I don't want to live next door to. You know what I mean?
The acknowledgement is, since we are different, and this is our base.
Something was censored there. Joel said some naughty words. Okay, so crucially, when we started distinguishing between racial groups in cultural terms, that was explicitly to actually stop English and what would become Canadian industrialists and agriculturalists and whatnot from bringing over coveted Indian labor. He just said Somali. He said something else that was censored. They blacked out that. They muted out that section. By the way, Joel asked if the N-word can be said before. I don't care. He's stupid. Like, these people are stupid. Even if he wins the debate, like, this doesn't win them anything. Did he just slur? I think he did, and I think that was muted out so that the stream wouldn't violate TOS. Anyways.
Baseline,
Let's have our own
some
space.
kind of common encounter, some kind of authentic encounter becomes possible because both are secure in their own.
Or what about like we all live in our own
Authentic
land?
encounter can
We're
ligma. Just go back to Somalia.
Yeah,
you
we
know
can
what I mean?
encounter people through like
This,
the
listen,
internet
this
or,
kind
like,
of racialist pathology is completely.
pathology.
How is it pathology?
It's like normal, healthy
It's
human
a
behavior.
complete
It's
modernistic
self-defeating.
perversion. It's a complete
literally
modern-
self-defeating.
It's a pathology because it refers human characteristics to non-human entities at human expense, right? So it refers qualities like deliberation and consciousness and preference to a category of physicality, of the color of your skin or your height or your geography even. And it takes that and it superimposes that over the actual deliberative action of communities, like states and things like that. You know, stuff where people actually get together, they talk about stuff, they vote on things, they make actual decisions. That doesn't happen in the context of ethnicity. And when an ethnicity, quote unquote, decides to self-segregate, what actually happens is some people who, for whatever reason, detect an interest in doing so, impose that segregation on the rest. That's the only way it can happen. Doesn't win anything. Keith got a $100 donation on his post-debate stream. Yeah, I know these guys are corrupt. It's not really surprising, though. He said N-word a few times in this debate. I missed it. Or they just censored it out pretty effectively.
Oh yeah, we got to
If
let all the
you look at the
Somalis in.
history of
This is like the
civilization,
Otherwise, we'd be
if you
feeling
look
like,
at
oh my
history
god,
of
I'm so
children,
liberal.
every
Children of
civilization has
technology.
been built based on an authentic. Only in modernity.
On Somalis.
Only in
How many
modernity
Somalis
do
are in
you have
China?
Man, I mean, you're
Anglo-Saxon
literally like Vosh. Like,
racism.
this is
No,
like,
it's a fact.
Like,
In
when it comes to
modernity
race and
alone,
these questions,
only
you're
in
just scared and you just
Cartesian,
become Vosh. You're no
only
different
in
from Vosh.
Cartesian modernity do we have people say we elevate the form of our culture for its own sake. We will never ever encounter anyone else. This is
Yeah,
a
because
result
the
of
Spartans
modernity.
were like, let's get some sub-Saharan Africans.
This
in
is
here, you know?
incestual pathology of modernity. Freud will describe this clearly.
Yeah. The two on the bottom are barbarians. They are antisocial barbarians who are propped up by the money of spiteful losers who, for whatever reason, manage to get a comfortable living for themselves but can't actually achieve any of their ends in society because they're hateful. That's my take on this. So much biological denialism. What biological denialism? Who's denying biology? Race isn't a biological category. It's socially imposed. It should be a biological category. It should refer specifically to descent, but it's being used to actually characterize, and it was at one point, when race didn't refer to the characteristics of a person living. What it referred to was literally just the people from whom you descended. And that was meant to do nothing, whatever, but determine as a matter of historical interest how certain people ended up in certain places. So when, for example, the French aristocrats characterized themselves as a different race as Germanic from the commoners and before the French Revolution, they didn't do so with disparagement. The point was to establish their right as conquerors to be in the position that they are in. It's not to say that they are better. That only happened as a cope after they had to flee to Germany. The referendum Keith is talking about is the 27th Amendment to the Irish Constitution. A news story at the time was a Chinese woman who gave birth in Northern Ireland and tried to fight deportation on the grounds of their child being an Irish citizen. Okay, interesting. Deportation from the UK on the grounds of their child being Irish, right. You know, these guys are creeps. Like, who would you rather live next to? Somebody from Somalia is trying to find work and support themselves, or somebody who obsessively hates brown people to the point that they're willing to ruin their reputation and be demonized by their society just to go online and just diss people who don't... I mean, frankly, all of these people look incredibly sickly except for the least white person on the screen, so it's a little bit strange. There are huge differences amongst ethnic groups brought about by thousands of years of evolution in vastly different environments. No, there aren't. There really aren't. And in fact, when you look at the rate and the time frame in which human beings spread and proliferated over the planet, there wasn't enough time for evolution to take place. This was relatively recent, and it happened so fast that it can't be imputed to natural selection. Our geographic diversity is the result of technology and culture, which has epigenetic consequences, but it's hardly determinative. It was also in the context of the Good Friday Agreement and was trying to limit the right of automatic citizenship to people with a tie to the island. Okay. I missed the point that's replying to, but that is interesting. I wonder if the two on the bottom actually want to achieve their stated goals. If they achieve their goals, they don't get to whine about being persecuted anymore. Maybe. I mean, like, principally, I don't think they think in terms of their stated goals. I think they think in terms of personal growth. They probably valorize it to themselves as being like the goals of the movement. But honestly, I think at the end of the day, Keith Woods and Joel Davis want to have a win on Hawes because Hawes is up and coming. And it looks good to their base. Like, people pay them for it, as was pointed out earlier. Race is now mostly used to a catch-all term for related ethnic groups. Not by people who are careful with their terms, in my experience. The brain took millions of years to develop. Skin color changes within 40,000 years. Yeah, exactly. How do Josh and Joel look sickly? They're like ghostly pale and slim. Also, I don't like them, so I'm going to say that.
Clearly as a form of incestual pathology.
Yeah, of course.
All
Freud
history
will,
of
like, we know
civilization
Freud's
before-
background.
all histories
What's
of
the most
civilization
popular kind of
before
porn in
modernity
Ireland?
is based on mutual encounter and mutual development between different peoples from
That
different
doesn't mean we need to be forced to live together.
What do you mean forced to live together? You're not
mass
forced to live
immigration.
together now.
Yes, it is. Mass immigration is against the democratic will in pretty much every country.
Okay, so who's pushing mass immigration?
The ruling class.
What do you mean against the democratic will? The democratic will is not a bunch of people prefer to not have people from a different country enter the country. The democratic or the general will is referring to what the state democratically arranged actually ends up doing. It's the democratic will, what they're referring to as public opinion. And there's no way whatsoever to determine that it's actually representative of the actual preferences of the people generally, or in any majority sense. And there's no way to determine whether or not the outcomes would actually reflect their wishes. This is stupid.
Capitalist
Okay,
elites.
are they communists? Are they the communists?
No, I'm an anti-capitalist. They're capitalist elites. This is the new form of neocolonialism, where
Listen,
instead
I'm
of settler
not saying-
colonialism,
So, like,
you take
alright,
the
for
old world
instance-
into the new world for cheap labor. And,
Listen,
No, that's not neocolonialism. Okay. Like, no, that's not. What about the different percentages of Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA in modern? I don't know. That's immaterial, though. Like, we're not talking about the fact that human beings obviously did evolve to have the capacities we do. We're talking about whether or not within a span of under 100,000 years, human beings were able to. No, not under 100,000. What am I talking about? In a time frame much shorter than the span of human evolution implicator, whether or not the geographic spread of human beings could result in determinative cognitive differences, which it can't. It's too short. Like that's just not material.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're run by liberals.
Keith, I'll
Run by
tell you, be
liberals.
careful.
I agree with you.
Yeah,
Look, here's what I'd say.
I'm not
Like, oh
disagreeing.
wow!
Ireland,
Oh my
let's
god,
say
we didn't know we were run by
Oh my
liberals.
god,
I
yeah.
was sitting
I
here
guess
this
I'm
whole
a
time.
communist now.
Let's
I guess
say
I'm a
My mind's
communist.
blown right now.
Capitalist sent some
Let's
Let's say Ireland becomes sovereign and leaves the EU, right? Let's assume this would happen. Sovereign country, self-determination, leaves the EU. Now it's a democratic state. It's going to curb immigration. It's not going to have this mass immigration. Fine. But Ireland now cannot benefit from the exploitation of the countries that people are coming from. Remember, if there's no intervention
Yeah,
in Syria,
good. I don't want
Iraq.
this exploitative neocolonial process.
yeah, so Ireland has to somehow integrate itself in the world order, in the world economy. Otherwise, Ireland's not
can do
going
that
to
without
become
mass immigration.
autarkic.
Countries can have like an integrated world order without mass immigration.
Yeah, but you still
Do you know
have
that
you're
China
still
has the
going
lowest
to-
number
I
of
agree,
foreign
I
born
agree.
population of any country in the world?
Listen, you are
Like,
still
why aren't you
going to have
advocating
to
for
address-
China to flood its
if
country with
Ireland needs
Africans so that they
something,
can have this
if
sincere
Ireland needs
encounter
something
with
from
the other?
Africa, Ireland must address the countries of Africa and their specific developmental situation. And if that involves exchange of specialists from Ireland, teach Africans with their education how to, so on, teach them engineering and so on, and then Africans come to Ireland to take advantage of being able to send money back home for, like, they
But
can
you
be
think
big.
refugees had a program jobs
I am
first,
not
you know?
I
advocating.
feel like I'm talking to both.
I
Like,
don't
you're just like
advocate
copes
for
for why you
chaotic.
don't want to endorse
I
this
don't
thing that's like
advocate for
illiberal. That's going to
chaotic
get you
mass
cancelled by
immigration.
leftists.
No. It's not.
I
about
do
that.
not
It's not about
advocate
that,
for
man.
chaotic mass immigration. All I'm saying is that it is pathological to think that there
Tribalism
must
is
be a preservation
pathological,
of a
which is like
purity.
the
There
most
can be no
human
encounter,
expression.
no kind of mutual.
Tribalism is pathological. Every single state that has lasted stably for a long period of time has either done so through militaristically keeping down a massive and incredibly dangerous population of slaves or some other underclass, or they have been open to switching to including new members of the state, or were situated as central hubs of trade and immigration. Like that's simply true. The most powerful political communities in history have been incredibly diverse and have not been hostile to mixing and exchange and things like that. As if to illustrate, the tribal is, in the emergence of political theory, the tribal is a lower stage of development from the political. It was recognized as something that was less potent and weaker and more barbaric. So, like, it's the difference between a community of conscious agents and a community of products, basically, of genetic products, right? So if you're a member of a tribe, you're born into it. What the tribe does, I mean, like tribes actually, unlike ethnicities, can actually have, and we want to be a little bit careful here. Tribes, unlike ethnicities, can actually have a deliberative capacity, because when we talk about tribe, we're talking about things like bloodlines connected with, like integrated into a some kind of social form. When they're saying tribalism, they're talking about tribalism of the ethnicity, of like the race. The race isn't a tribe, first of all, so the tribalism itself is spurious, and it lacks a deliberative capacity, so it can't do things to begin with. But if we're being like really technical with our terms here, I mean, that's just a nonsense term. The only sense in which tribalism actually makes sense is like the advocacy for, again, the preference towards the tribe as the social form. That's a more primitive form to a political community in which there is conscious reason derived from the individual for belonging, right? Civilizations move past the need for tribal association. We've grown up. Yeah, well, that's why tribal association is now a reactionary or a revolutionary of sort. Revolutionary in the sense of like seditionist, really. Slogan or totem or whatever. When you have no arguments left to throw around the word racism, trust me, it will make you feel better. What are we referring to here? I haven't even called them racist. I mean, they are racist, but that's beside the point. I'm not calling them racist as a normative condemnation, although you could also do that, justly, I think. I'm calling them racist because there's an ideological insistence on dividing people according to races, and that's the thing that they're principally sensitive to in making their deliberations about what kind of society is better or worse, and I think that's stupid. I mean, let's assume for the sake of argument even that their assumptions about like inherent abilities between racial groups was true. It's still nonetheless reducing human beings to things, not agents. It's gross. But they're also incorrect about that. The actual role of genes is obscure to us, and we know to a certainty at this point that the vast majority of people their outcomes are vastly dependent upon education and upbringing and nutrition and all these different things. Wait, why does the tribe have a deliberative ability? Because in antiquity, there would be tribal elders, and your belonging to the tribe was religiously determined. So there would still be people in the tribe who could make decisions, and they would still be representatives of the tribe because the tribe was effectively a religious association. When we're talking about tribalism today, we're talking about taking characteristics out of a complex of different kinds of associations that already exist and treating that as fundamental. So we're no longer talking about like the rights of citizens or the rights of religious elders or things like that. We are talking literally about the rights of a category of physical characteristic, or a subset of a category of physical characteristics. Have I ever heard of the spiritual racism of Julius Evola? Yes, I have. It's silly. It's silly for the same reason that Hegel characterizes and criticizes phrenology as effectively reducing spirit to a bone, right? Your personality and your spirit, shall we say, is not downstream from anything biological about you besides the bare fact of you being a human being. Everything else is contingent and circumstantial.
Are tribal, like.
It has nothing to do with tribes. Nothing.
I mean, that's what like the ethnos is. It's just
human beings are not inherently tribal. That's stupid. Like, we're not. Even if you can determine that there is a tendency for people of certain characteristics that societies are peculiarly sensitive to group together and to isolate themselves from other groups of that kind, that isn't to say that human beings are essentially tribal. That is to say that human beings are pressured into a tribal attitude, and the reasons are completely obscure to us. That doesn't answer the question. The question is of cause, right? When we're saying that human beings are essentially tribal, we are making an argument in favor of tribalism as a cause of segregation. We're not, for example, arguing that there are already segregating processes that tend us to tribalism that are extrinsic to human nature. Zenzi says, to paraphrase James Connolly, patriotism of the soil is an allegiance of a capitalistic subdivision of classes to be exploited on that soil. Patriotism of the nation is to see the soil as mere location. Yeah, well said.
It's not.
Mass immigration is not a communist policy. Mass immigration is not a
I
communist
know.
policy.
I'm not arguing with that. I'm not like one of
I know.
Anti-communist.
So, I know.
Things like
I know.
secret, like,
But listen,
Marxists that
I
are
know.
directing everything.
I know. But I think it's important to note this, right? Because this wasn't a democratic thing, right? As you're saying, it's not something people adopted. This is something that has been forced down onto people in a lot of cases. But that isn't the result of like communists. Like this is the result of liberals. So if you want this to stop, you have to fucking have a actual republic. But at the same time,
yeah, you have to oppose global neocolonial capitalism.
The people holding you back.
The only things that really oppose neoliberalism, like
the people holding you back from that. The people holding you back from that are not the immigrants themselves. Those are not the people who are keeping you from changing these policies, right? So when you pathologize but when you pathologize and you say, if we expelled them, if we expelled these immigrants, then suddenly everything would be fine, and then we would be
that's
able
just a
to have
caricature. Straw man. Like,
listen, when you also dehumanize, hold on, when you dehumanize immigrants and speak about them,
not dehumanize, just go be human back in your own country.
Dehumanize them. Give me an example of me.
Because of this kind of language I'm hearing from Joel and so on. You don't have to disrespect others. Why disrespect? Why not be human?
I haven't dehumanized them. I think that they would be better off in their countries of origin.
By the way, this is why on Count Dankula's definition, these people can get away with not being called white supremacists. That's the point. See? That's the argument that's deployed. It's like, hey, look, I'm not actually a white supremacist. I think that races should be separated for their own good. You know, away from me in the poorer places so that we can just benefit from exploitation for ourselves. Yeah. Like, it's I actually wanted to check something because I was a little bit curious. I noticed that Dylan Burns was kind of softballing Doomer politics in this when he was talking to him. I think he did a good job overall. But I want to go back and I want to see if Dylan Burns actually makes the same distinction between those two different characterizations of white supremacy. Because he is very integrated with, again, like the Destiny and the Vosh sphere, and I'm a little bit curious if he made that same if he made that same distinction at some point. Because it struck me as very suspect that you could more or less tell who found those distinctions different based upon whether or not they, for whatever reason, seem to have some kind of slant in favor or against the arguments of that video. You are not living in reality, we are primates? What does that have to do with anything? What are you saying? So what does it mean if you must be very smart to convince yourself of something so stupid? What are you referring to? Metabolo, what are you referring to? Is the argument that we're primates, therefore we, I don't know, embody like primate tendencies in terms of like community isolation, or what? This is stupid. Oh, by the way, Blue Wrenches, if you see people making slurs or whatnot in the chat, get rid of them, please. Thank you. Although I have to say, my chat is very nice. I have a very, very pleasant audience.
They would say the same, man. They would say the fucking same.
There's no need to disrespect.
Why'd they come here then?
Because which immigrants
Why would they come? If you had the opportunity to help your family back home, would you do it?
Okay, so the argument from Metabolo is that the argument he is contending with, that tribalism isn't an inherent characteristic to Homo sapiens. Archaeological evidence going back 200,000 years are beg to differ. What does the age of the archaeological evidence showing, like, what are you talking about? 200,000 years ago, people weren't self-segregating based on race. Communities were too small. They were family groups for the most part, or extended tribes. But they weren't separating themselves consciously on those grounds. And how would you determine if they were? We're talking about mummies and things like that. That's silly. Anyways.
Yeah, I don't blame the individual immigrant.
Yeah.
Joel, aren't you in America now?
Well, you're arguing against the caricature.
Oh yeah, somebody even brought up the fact that we had someone brought up different concentrations of Neanderthal DNA in different ethnic groups. That would be in favor of extreme anti-tribalism, of extreme mixing, right? We're talking about, yeah, no, that doesn't work that way. You make very, very modest extrapolations from the archaeological data. You don't assume motives. You can't infer the motives of a mummy, guys. That doesn't work. Like, what is the archaeological evidence showing that people were tribal? Did you find, like, whites-only signs, like, 200,000 years old? No, what you probably found was, hey, a lot of people who occupied the same area over an extended period of time sort of looked the same and wore the same dress, as extrapolated from, like, the 5 or so that we managed to find intact. That's not only not shown by the archaeological data. That's something that can't be shown by archaeological data.
And no
Joel,
disrespect.
aren't you in America now? Like, you're Australian. Why are you doing fucking in my country? Get the fuck out of here. What are you doing here?
That's not.
What? Okay. I'm like the same. I'm the same ethnos as you.
Me and Joel are against.
I don't
like,
give a shit.
people Going taking holidays.
You're not an American.
Okay,
You don't actually appreciate. You don't appreciate America.
Have you read?
Technically, Australia was a prison colony, so he actually should be in Britain, right? Or in America, wherever he is. No, he shouldn't be in America. He should be in Britain.
The book.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought this was America.
I don't give a fuck about civic identity. What matters
Now you're
is-
liberal.
I recommend you a book. Read a book called Ethnos and Sociology by Alexander Dugin. He will make it very, very clear. Ethnos
Yeah,
has
Dugan is like on race.
Dugan is like,
No, no, no.
if a Somali becomes Orthodox Christian, they're Russian.
Then
You know what I mean?
Yeah. fuck
Yes,
that. It's like,
this is what happened.
Oh,
to
yeah.
Oh man.
Pushkin was African. Pushkin was an African.
Pushkin was
descended from African slaves. African slave.
Hey, point to Dugan. Guess he's not as dumb as I thought he was. What is this shit-eating grin on Keith's face?
Came to Russia, became Russian, and there are
He wrote the
aristocratic
best poetry.
lineages within Russia descending from this African guy, and they became
Gannibal.
Russified. And then also the Tatars and the Turks and all sorts Mongols, all sorts of syncretism is what defines the modern Russian.
The best,
Yeah, mixing
the best,
happens.
the best
and there's also
Soviet
like
music
plenty of
was from
ethnic groups that have
Koreans.
endured for thousands of years that have been quite happy like with their own
No,
culture.
for thousands of years, it's only been a continual encounter between different
I don't know,
people.
man. Like the Pashtuns have been around a while. The Jews have been around a while.
All of those people are mixed in with others.
Yeah, even, like, yeah, all those groups are tremendously mixed. What the hell is he talking about? There are tons of different kinds of Jews. Hell, there are tons of different kinds of Greeks. Again, like, I don't know how... Keith Woods, a few generations ago, not that long ago, is not as white as he thinks he is. I get a strong discount Tobey Maguire vibe from this guy. No. Oh god, how much is left? We're gonna call it soon, guys. We've been going for almost 4 hours. Let's go for a few more minutes, see if something funny comes up, and then we'll call it.
So like we should just like mix like the whole world together.
No, you don't have to go out of your way
Mix in
to
any
do it.
group.
If it happens naturally, why oppose it?
It's not natural. That's what I'm saying. If people like the natural
That's
state
like
is
saying
for people to be
that's like saying
tribal.
marrying someone not in your family isn't natural.
It's not like saying that at all. That makes no sense.
You're the one that's trying to force the unnatural thing. Like no,
No,
like
how am I forcing it? I'm not forcing.
Okay, so to be clear, like when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about allowing people in. And people are coming in either because they're refugees or because they want to take part in a political community that confers better rights than the one they come from, which, by the way, is an essential part of liberalism. Because the whole principle of tacit consent, you can't consent to your government if you don't have the choice to choose otherwise. And business, again, paying people to come in to do work. This isn't like, we're not talking about like some evil Soros figure moving populations around to just destroy Western civilization. We're talking about the natural outcome of people being freely allowed to do things. There's the weirdest conversation happening in chat right now. Anyways. Yeah, no, so, like, it's not natural in the sense that that's what primates would do. Obviously, we wouldn't have, like, this kind of, like, constant interchange of people from vastly disparate places so quickly all the time. But it's certainly natural in the sense that it's spontaneous and not contrived. So in that sense, it actually is quite like marrying somebody outside of your family. FYI, Black Irish isn't referencing people with black skin. It's referencing people what would be considered Mediterranean features. That's my point, Zanzi. That's why I'm bringing it up. Because the point is that even having what we would identify now as white skin is not by itself, doesn't by itself distinguish you as like simply a white person, right? So what's being challenged here is the concept of whiteness itself, as like this sort of ubiquitous thing such that you can talk about a white tribe. Does that make sense? Yeah, it can't be too short. Yeah, I should have clarified that. No, because I think, shoot, what's his name? Yeah, because Yeats was Black Irish, was he not?
Without liberal propaganda, like Irish people.
This is what you don't understand. Before liberalism, this was the norm. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, I don't know, man. I mean, doesn't the existence of like lots of ethnic groups show that like we've been becoming like more diversified in terms of like splitting off? And
yes, but this also corresponds to mutual encounter between different peoples. It's one and the same dialectic. It's not the diversification.
Yeah, I mean, look at what is the Irish made up of? What is Irish made up of? Irish, you've got fucking people with Iberian.
Zanzi says, our geological history, I will add to that. Sorry, our genealogy and mythology says that the Irish are the 6th group to land in Ireland, displaced the natives, and were from northern Spain. You colonial bastards.
Heritage, you've got the old Norsemen that were in.
The thing is, like, ethnogenesis.
Yeah, right. I guess it's just not African.
The million times over hundreds of years.
Ethnogenesis, like the way that it's being done now, there's no possibility of ethnogenesis. Like this is like that's a slow organic process. Like you look at America today, like that.
The Vikings were slow and organic.
You have.
You guys are just defending this because you're scared. Like this is not a natural.
No, scared of what?
This is a modern neo-colonial capitalist position, and you're
I'm opposed to some of the same things you are.
The modern capitalist position is one which conceives ethnos and nationality as pure forms, which have no dialectic.
No, all that happens is like race deconstruction.
No, that's true. That actually is true. Now, it's not directly downstream from capitalism per se, but that is true. These are very recent categories that are only practicable of modern political categories, or modern political distinctions rather. These concepts don't just fall from the sky. Well, actually, no, they come out of history, and sometimes they're not just like logical developments of things that are actually in the world. Sometimes they're the result of people construing history in certain ways, and we just take on those construals as if they're facts, and then things spin off from those, right? The concept of race is a case in point. The idea that races had specific qualities associated with them that weren't directly tied to the tendency of people of certain races in the sense of descent to have certain family connections that would, cause them to have like a class distinction as well. That's super recent. Oh my god, that felt so good. I don't even know what that was. Something cracked in my shoulder. Okay. What is Stone Age communism? I think he just means like family groups, basically. Like the fact that there isn't like a contractual relation between members of a tribe in the wilderness. Oh yeah, good point. Did George Soros bring Christopher Columbus to Haiti?
All the stuff you're saying about like, oh, the world is mixed with different groups, this is always coming from
it's being specific. It's being specific because there is no white people. Like, white people is not a distinct category.
You guys are
we're talking about ethnicity, and now you're talking about race. Like,
Listen, liberalism is precisely what requires the formal purity of the subject. You are the liberal.
Doesn't make any fucking sense. Like, what do you
all
mean?
my ancestors for like thousands of years were like liberals because they had a sense
No,
of like
your
extended
ancestors are
folk.
mixed with other people's.
The story of Irish nationalism and like Irish republicanism is a very old story, as you
you're
would know,
Irish.
but no, there wasn't.
Yeah, it's like, it wasn't
Irish
civic
identity.
nationalism.
Keith,
they were
Irish,
fighting
right?
for a country.
There's republicanism.
Hold on, Keith.
Yeah, but Irish
The Republicans were fighting for a country for the Irish. Ireland for the Irish.
Possibility.
Why shouldn't Connacht be
Quote from
independent?
Patrick Pearse.
Keith,
Why
since you're
can't
Irish,
Connacht be
you know there's a high
independent?
possibility my ancestors gave birth to yours, the Phoenicians. You know that's like a theory, right?
Okay, but like, what is like? I don't get like this. Isn't some like big BTFO like groups have mixed through history? Okay, like my
There's no
extended
theory.
group
There's no
exists.
I'm not saying force anything. I'm just saying if it happens.
I guess that answers the question then. How's his Lebanese, right? Because somebody was asking that earlier. That's interesting. Am I right? Are Lebanese are Phoenician, right? Or am I wrong on that? Because I have a Lebanese friend who said the same thing. But my history is not good on that.
Happens naturally, why be scared?
It's not happening naturally, and I'm saying groups should have the right to resist it. But you're like just a priori against people.
No,
So,
no
like,
one
you go
should
out,
be
you go
forced.
out and you meet a nice like Middle Eastern girl who's came to Ireland.
Metabaddies.
Yeah, you're gonna stop that for your racial purity, really?
Yeah, I want my kids to look like me. What's wrong with that?
So you really like this girl?
When Europeans first got to Australia, they weren't even sure if the native peoples were the same species. Well, that was stupid of them, wasn't it? Although we appear to have Joel Davis with us in the comments. Keep an eye on him, would you? He's been a naughty boy in the debate so far. President Sunday, what do you make of a 5% difference in archaic subspecies DNA in different populations? I don't know. Not very much, to be totally honest with you. Ireland is a 4.9 million person papal base that will attack the true Church of England when they're at their weakest. They cannot be trusted. Joel Davis, only an intellectual could be stupid enough to deny the reality of racial differences. You can't read well, can you, Joel? Like, what are your sources for the reality of racial differences? Because every source that I've seen that affirms them relies on incredibly flawed studies and massive amounts of conjecture and forcing an interpretation of the data that just doesn't withstand scrutiny. So, and by the way, the smartest people alive, people, by the way, who are parts of political movements that have actually succeeded, so borne out in intelligence both in practice and in theory, deny you categorically. Maybe you're just more intellectual than I am.
She's great, etc. And then you're gonna turn her down because you're gonna say, "I'm sorry, but I care about my race more than."
Yeah,
Listen,
let my kids to look like me.
No, let me be fair, because I like people from my background too, most of the time, right? But if I meet someone who's not from my background and still satisfies the essence of what I look for someone, then I'm not going to turn them down just because they're from a different background. But if I only turn them down just because they're a different background, I'm betraying the essence of what I am in the name of some idolatrous.
Yeah, we all have black friends, bro.
I want my kids to look like me.
You know what?
You're
Like,
not
I
having
think
kids in the first place.
Look.
No, he's betraying what he is as a human being. He is determining one of his most important human connections on the basis of something that is on the least essential part of what a human being is. Like human beings, what distinguishes us from physical, from like merely like material objects, is that we have minds and creativity and spontaneity and feelings and things. Like we can create things. It has nothing to do with, and we can grow ourselves through hard work and through education and through interpersonal exchange. To choose who you associate with based on something as mentally significant as your fingernails is a betrayal. It is, as Hegel says, to treat spirit as if it's a bone. The problem, Joel, is that you're a bug man.
look, I prefer my kids. I prefer my kids to look like me too. But here's the thing: I am also at the mercy of destiny, at fate. I'm not God. I can't say I know what I am exactly. I don't know exactly who I am and what I am. That's something suspended.
I mean, do you see the lens you're going to? Like, when me and Joel are just like, yeah, groups should be allowed to just like have their own like living spaces and like, you know, not have to deal with other groups. And like, you're going like to the lengths of like.
Okay, so you don't want to take Northern Ireland back?
Because this is the issue.
They're fine?
This is the issue. Right?
Why not leave Ulster? Why can't we
exactly
Northern Ireland?
Of national sovereignty and self-determination. I don't want anyone to be forced military to do anything, right? But I can still critique this position as from a human and moral so on perspective without forcing anything. I can still argue with it and say this is a false path. This is a false path.
All right. Well, is it immoral if someone wants their children to look like them and just like chooses not to miscegenate?
You want your children to look like you. That's what you care about. I mean, first of all, no offense, Keith. I don't want my children to look like you, and I don't think you should either. But, like, again, like, I can't help but point out that the Phoenician here is the best looking of the people in the group. But once I'm like imagine that. Like, you don't care if they love the same things you love. You don't care if they make the kinds of things that you respect. You don't care if they have like virtues and openness and bravery and things like that. You care about them looking like you. That's pathetic. That's pathetic. And by the way, your children won't look like you anyways. The amount of diversity even within like massively, unless again you're talking about pure incest. If you want your kids to look exactly like you, that's a good way to go. Sunday I'm talking nonsense. I mean, again, like, you're the one relying on you're the one relying on categories that you Keith wasn't denying these other qualities. Well, by implication he is, though. If you are deciding that you are not going to associate with people on the grounds that you don't want your descendants to look differently from you, then you are prioritizing your physicality to any other concern. By implication. I will say this, Keith. I think you're correct. I don't think has destroyed you in this debate. I think you were already dead. I think what has brought out, though, is that you guys are so stupid that you can't even like keep the veil on for a couple of hours. Like, has doesn't need to beat you to win this debate. You're already beaten. Yeah, you bodied them, but with corpses. And, you know, Logo didn't do so great. That's undeniable. You guys should get some sun.
Well, I think from a cultural perspective, if you want people to look like you, just fuck your siblings.
Yeah.
Terrible argument.
The optimal, like
way ahead of your dare.
Amount of like genetic drift is like third cousin or something.
Because the essence of what you truly are is suspended in reality. You have no formal certainty over what that will look like. None.
I don't know. I can pretty much choose where I want to
who you are can look like something you didn't expect. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, I know if I have a kid with a black person, my child is going to be less genetically similar to me than like some random Irish person I meet on the street.
So what?
So I want my children to be genetically similar to me, like this.
This is a weird, this is like a weird Bill Gates.
What's weird about this? This is like the most natural thing about it.
You sound like
you guys are losers. Why do you want your children to be like you? You don't even know the history of your own concepts. By the way, I actually challenged Keith to a debate on race, and he wouldn't do it.
No one has
more empathy for people that are genetically similar.
Listen, man,
like
your great-grandfather.
You're talking in the language of modern science to describe ancient and so on primordial realities. It's complete vulgarity. Genetic. What do you mean genetic? Genetic means what?
Listen, man, your great-grandfather would have been like, yeah, I'll marry a Spanish Catholic girl, but no way would I marry a Protestant. Like, this isn't how people thought in history at all. My grandparents were big.
By the way, that still stands. I'll debate you on race, Keith. I'll do it. Let me know when.
Sure,
He's
Keith would
Irish.
marry a Spanish Catholic girl too. Like,
Yeah, exactly. But so like, isn't that a non-genetic?
Yeah, white's all right, you know?
I don't know. It's so dumb.
Anyway.
It's so fucking stupid.
Listen, I
because
think
what you're really
people-
saying is like
people
you're like
are-
obsessed with like this eugenics notion that like your genes are superior to other genes, so you gotta keep them pure. It's just stupid.
Well,
Not how anyone in your family has ever
Okay,
thought
so
through all of
we have
history.
What was that? What was that? What did his superior genes make him blurt out on stream that not even the kill stream could keep it in? I'm sort of getting like, you know the xenomorph? Like it's like the perfect organism, right? The perfect organism that keeps on violently destroying its environment and killing everybody around it, inevitably resulting in its own death in every single episode. That's what this is.
It's very
for
modern pathology.
Well, we've been going for 2 hours and a half.
You want me to run in?
Wrap this up,
Let me.
'cause I
We
do
can
have
wrap
to-
it up. Let me run in the callers real quick, just on a lightning round type deal, because they have been waiting a while. If that's okay.
I don't care about that. All right, we're at the end. Dear God, this is painful. Again, the two people on the bottom lost before they came in, so it doesn't actually matter about their performance. Their performance was parasitic on the failures of Infrared and Logos here. So my general judgment of this is Infrared needed to really push on some particular key points and keep the conversation restricted to those, because this meandered so quickly and so far that it actually became difficult to even keep track of what they were trying to argue the points for, right? And Logo just wasn't prepared. There's no way around it. I don't think he's stupid, but he just wasn't prepared. And him and Joel both are just like interjecting random things. It was weird. I don't know what the British intelligence thing was supposed to determine. It was weak. No, it's not that I don't like you, Keith. It's that your positions are inherently stupid. They're inherently stupid. They're not borne out by the science. They're not borne out by history. You have them because you hate some random group of people you've never encountered for the most part. And you have so little savvy that you sabotage your own movement. Cynically, I'll probably admit. I think you I think you recognize the upshot of what you're doing. But you'll sabotage the palatability of your own movement to get in a few digs at Haas. It's stupid. You're not smart. Do I think China is really Marxist? I don't need to think China is really Marxist. It's immaterial. The question of the debate was whether China was fascist. Your arguments were stupid. No, China's not fascist. Or do I think this is just ideology? I don't know what you mean by ideology. I know you used ideology in a terrible way earlier, so. Anyways, we've been here for 4 hours, I'm calling it. Thanks everybody for joining us. Take care.